Chapter 902. It was the last few days of the month of frost, and the weather outside was so cold that it made one's teeth chatter. The deciduous forests around Maxen and Schaflund couldn't escape the bleak scene. The trees were starting to become bare, and a thick layer of withered leaves had fallen on the ground since late autumn. It was as if a gray carpet had been laid out in layers between the trees. There were even a few light snowfalls in the northern regions. Although it wasn't to the extent of being covered in snow, it was at least an omen of winter in the year of the sword. This was the worst month of the year to start a war, but the Holy War just had to start at this time. History was always so unreasonable, and sometimes it was even more whimsical than the stories described. In Abes, only the black pine forest outside the Baron's castle was still tall and green in the midst of the solemn atmosphere of war. However, there was a faint black color between the canopy of the trees, as if the entire shade of the trees was a ghost hovering overhead. When the cold wind whistled past the tips of the pine trees, it made a strange whistling sound that made one's hair stand on end. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The guests of Trendheim were stomping their feet and rubbing their hands as they complained about the horrible weather. Most of them were dressed in bright clothes and had the air of a big city. They didn't look like locals at all. A dozen or so carriages were parked outside the courtyard, their bodies painted with all kinds of emblems. Each one represented the glorious history of a family. These nobles came from all over the Erewhon, and most of them were here for the first time in Tanajul. They were here for only one purpose: to go on a diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire. It was also a rare time for Abes Castle to be lively, although it didn't matter if the owner was willing to receive these guests. Although Brando was nominally the head of the diplomatic mission to the Cruz Empire, and he could choose any members to accompany him, an ancient tradition dictated that there must be some fixed seats in the diplomatic mission, and these seats were those that Brando couldn't specify. Among them there was one representative of the royal family, and Prince Haruz would represent the House of Corvado. In addition, he could also choose 2 maids, an attendant, and an accompanying knight. The original list included Madame Windsor and Madame Sigma, the 2 wet nurses of His Royal Highness when he was in Winterclaw Castle. However, Haruz asked Brando to replace Madame Windsor with Medusa Lysimeka at the last minute, which made Brando wonder if the prince had reached the age of love. As for his attendant, he was a young man from Corvado whom Brando had never heard of before. He must be a member of the royal family, and the accompanying knight was naturally the most trusted candidate of Her Royal Highness Maynard. In addition to the Corvado royal family, according to the agreement of the Holy Cathedral, the former royal family of Erewhon, the Cipher royal family should also send a representative. However, this representative naturally couldn't travel thousands of miles across Ampere Seal for a week or 2 to meet them here. The princess brother had already sent a letter to tell them that he had chosen a candidate. The envoy and his entourage would meet them in Grey Mountain, so his sister and the count didn't have to worry too much. Then came the 4 dukes, Viro, Grinoires, Lantanailan, and Karsuk, and the 3 counts, Janilisup, Yenbao, and Greymont, with the Marquis of Balta, each with a representative. Originally, there should have been a representative of Erech and Radnor, but now these 2 territories had been removed and became part of the royal family's territory in Tanajul. The Erech family was few in number, and after the Battle of Ampere Seal they were basically wiped out. Count Radnor and his family were still eating prison food in Majidin's dungeon, so it was naturally impossible for them to send a representative. Among the 4 dukes, Duke Viro directly sent his youngest daughter, Duke Talantalan's envoy Duke Eek, and Duke Karsuk sent a meatball who was said to be his second son. As for Duke Grinoires, he also sent a daughter, but she was only a little girl of 7 or 8 years old. Count Janilasu was a believer of the Silver Lion Association. He did not have a wife, so naturally he did not have any children. He sent a sergeant whom he thought highly of, a very energetic young man. The envoy of the Grey Mountain did not come to Tanajul either, so naturally he was waiting with the envoy of Cipher to meet them in Grey Mountain. In the end, there was a small twist in the choice of Count Yenbao's envoy, because there was no news of Count Yenbao for a long time. In the middle of the month of frost, Baron Dahl sent an envoy himself, but he was directly driven away by the angry princess. In the end, Dilfrey decided to personally serve as Yenbao's envoy. Firstly, she could leave an impression on the future successor of Yenbao in the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and secondly, she could thwart Baron Dahl's conspiracy. Brando considered her physical condition and specially prepared a larger carriage for her. Most of these nobles had their own attendants, ranging from 1 to 3. Thus, when added together, it was a bloated group of 20 or so people in 5 or 6 carriages. However, if one thought that this group was large enough, then one would be gravely mistaken. Brando soon found that there were some unexpected guests in this team. One of them was Princess Magadal. As the Princess of Antiburo, she naturally had to represent her duchy to Cruz. Originally, the Empire thought that she had died in the war in Ampere Seal, so the order was also passed to the duchy, hoping that the duchy could send another envoy to Cruz. But this news somehow reached the ears of the nun princess, and after she heard the news, she insisted on being the envoy of Antiburo to the Empire. She also privately communicated with the Antiburo royal family, so Brando naturally could not stop her. After all, the princess was recuperating in Tanajal, not under house arrest, so he had no reason to restrict her freedom to contact the outside world. And another uninvited guest was now in front of Brando. At this moment, Brando was staring at the merchant lady in front of him, who was wearing a thick fur coat, boots, gloves, a scarf and a bearskin hat. Her small face was almost only revealing a pair of black eyes. He looked at the large suitcase in her small hands and finally couldn't help but ask, "Well, now can you tell me what are you planning to do here?" "Go to the Empire with Brando, I haven't been there yet." The little Roman raised her chin, revealing her small mouth from under the scarf, and answered matter-of-factly. Brando rolled his eyes. "Of course I know that, but I already said that there are no more places for the diplomatic group. Also, you don't seem to remember, I told you to stay in Tanajal obediently, and leave yourself in a safer place. Don't make me worry, understand?" He couldn't help but facepalm. This girl clearly promised him yesterday that there were no more places for the diplomatic group, and told him to stay in the territory obediently and support Amandina. She clearly promised that she would never take up a place in the diplomatic group. Wait, Brando suddenly froze in place, then reacted and glared at the young lady. "Oh, damn it, you're playing word games with me again." "Nope." The little Roman blew a white breath on her hand and answered with a smile, "I'm perfectly justified." "Justified my ass." Brando pinched her face. "Listen to me obediently, stay in Tanajal, you're not allowed to go anywhere." Brando pinched the merchant girl's face for a while, but seeing her waving her hands and trying to break free from his hand, he couldn't help but feel a little suspicious. This was not in line with the young lady's temperament. He couldn't help but let go and asked doubtfully, "All right, tell me, why are you going to the Empire?" The little Roman rubbed her red cheeks and showed a fierce look. "I've been invited by the Holy Cathedral of Fire, as the president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, and as a distinguished guest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, I'm going to the Cruz Empire to participate in the ceremony of the Holy War." She deliberately emphasized the word distinguished guest, and then handed the invitation to Brando. Brando opened the parchment letter, and almost blacked out and fell to the ground. The Holy Cathedral of Fire did invite some famous businessmen, poets, and even artists and scholars of various fields to participate in the annual large-scale celebration, or in commemoration of the opening of the Holy War, but he never dreamed that the Roman would be on the list, his somewhat muddle-headed and unreliable fiancée. He couldn't help but read the letter several times, and finally confirmed that the magic wax seal on the letter was the real emblem of the Holy Cathedral. After confirming that there was no mistake, he had to admit that this thing didn't look fake. He raised his head and looked at the Roman as if he was looking at an alien. "When did your business become so big?" "Very long ago. The Holy Cathedral of Fire invited me to the Harvest Festival this year, but at that time they were going to Ampere Seal. I've already been there, so I don't want to go anymore. It's not fun at all." The little Roman replied casually, as if the invitation from the Holy Cathedral of Fire was just an invitation for her to go on a trip, and whether she would go or not depended on her mood. Brando almost knelt down to her. The Holy Cathedral of Fire's tradition of inviting celebrities had always existed in the game. At that time, there were some famous merchant guilds among the players in Erewhon. Until the Second Era, these merchant guilds with major sponsors behind them would often break their heads over such an invitation letter. There were even a few instances where it almost led to a war between the merchant guilds. At least, Brando had seen it happen a few times. Brando carefully looked at his almighty fiancée, and felt that there must be something like Martha's daughter behind this. But in the end, it was Amandina who cleared his doubts. It turned out that many of the resources produced in the Black Forest, including some precious magic materials and magic crystals, were strategic resources that the Holy Cathedral of Fire urgently needed, especially during the period before the start of the Holy War. Tanajal's large exports in the past year had long made it an important partner in the eyes of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, so it was not surprising that the Roman, the nominal president of the Seven Seas Merchant Guild, was valued by the Holy Cathedral. But Brando shook his head, still thinking that Amandina had used a cheat. One must know that to become a merchant that could trade with the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was not only enough to have a supply of goods, but also required a considerable network of contacts. He did not have to think to guess that the Roman must have used the connections of the merchant guilds in Ampere Seal. But as for how she did it, it was a bit ridiculous. Because this could only be explained by a miracle in Amandina's opinion. "Can I go now, Brando?" The little Roman covered her face and asked pitifully, but there was clearly a little pride in her voice. "Up to you." Brando replied in a bad mood. He felt that in front of this little fiancée, his intelligence and sense of existence as a count had been severely devalued, and this made him feel very hurt. "Then Brando, help me prepare a carriage. I want the one I usually use, and there's a stove on it that can put charcoal." "No, go to my carriage obediently." "Oh." After sending away the Roman lady and the second son of Duke Karsuk, who was almost the same height and width, who had been trying to get close to him, Brando finally broke away from the group of young masters and ladies. He walked to the side of the carriage and just happened to see Ferlin coming out of the castle with a notebook in her hand. He saw the elder of the Wild Elf sisters and knew that the things she had prepared were probably done. He hurriedly greeted her. "Ferlin." "My lord. Are Brunhilde and the others ready?" The elder of the Wild Elf sisters nodded. "Very good." Brendel finally let out a sigh of relief in his heart. This trip was not really to bring these young ladies and young masters out for a vacation, it was just a pretense on the surface. Moreover, Princess Griffine had appointed him as the leader of the envoy group and the commander of the Southern Legion. This appointment had arrived earlier, and it was obvious that she wanted him to transfer the elites from Tonajul to form the accompanying guards for this envoy group. This was a tradition that had been tacitly agreed upon. Before the start of the Holy War, the Empire had summoned the envoys of the various kingdoms and duchies. This had become a tradition since the First Holy War. Today this was not only a way for the Holy Cathedral of Fire to confirm the confidence of the participants, but also a way for the vassal states to compete with each other to obtain a higher status in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. In this envoy group, first of all, the noble families had to greet the representatives of the Empire. This in itself represented a kind of respectful submission, and was also a way for the vassal states to pledge their loyalty to the Holy Cathedral. Of course, this kind of greeting was not so blatant and was a little more reserved. On the other hand, there was the accompanying guards of the envoy group. After all, the Holy War was a war, and every country needed to show their strength to the Holy Cathedral of Fire to obtain a corresponding status in the war and even after. The guards of the envoy group were a means of showing off. Generally speaking, the guards of the envoy group were the most elite forces of each country, representing the highest standard of the duchies and kingdoms, and also the face of the nobles and the royal family. In order to maintain this face and glory, these guards of the envoy group would even compete with each other in the Cruz Empire and clash with each other. Of course, this kind of conflict rarely led to bloodshed, but the side that lost face most of the time would not have a good time after returning to their country. The most powerful guard group of the envoy group in all the previous holy wars should be from the Black Raven Duchy in the west of the empire. This duchy was adjacent to the Hazel people and the Holy Cathedral of Earth. Although the duchy accepted the faith of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the inhabitants were half-orcs and half-beastmen, and the people were very valiant, and the nobles were also very martial. At that time they sent out a guard group composed of bear warriors, and whether it was in terms of quantity or quality, they crushed the guards of the other countries. Unfortunately, they met the Erewhon people of that era. In that holy war, the envoy group sent out by the Erewhon people could be regarded as the most shabby one in all the previous holy wars. Other than the nobles' representatives, the envoy group was made up of the officers of the White Lion Legion, and there were less than 20 people in total. However, the problem was that the captain of this group of 20 people was the Earth Sword Saint Darius, and the vice-captain was the scholar of the Mithril Fortress, Tulman. These two people swept away everyone, including the people of Cruz. As for how Brando's famous grandfather later became the marshal of the Allied forces, that was another story. The envoy group was the face of Erewhon, and Tonajul was now the strongest territory in the entire Erewhon Empire. Therefore, when the princess chose Brando as the leader of the envoy group, although the royal faction had objections, they did not dare to oppose too much. As for Brando and Her Royal Highness, the two of them had reached a tacit understanding, and they used this as an excuse to brazenly stuff people into this so-called guard group. As for what these people would do in Cruz in the end, that was hard to say. Brando took the notebook from Falern's hand and casually flipped through it, then looked up at the entire convoy and said softly, "Then let's go, we'll see you in Cruz." Finally he added in a low voice, Holy War. Holy War, here I come. P.S. You promised to be the second update, and by the way, ask for next month's monthly votes, students. Also, vote for Blackie and help him keep the 6th place in the classification. Chapter 904. When Brando first set foot on the land of the Grey Mountains, he had a very real feeling in his heart. Wine Merva's lit? The mountains were like fangs piercing into the sky. The mountain people used their language to describe the mountains in the north, and it was undoubtedly the most exquisite rhetoric for the steep and sharp peaks with gray limestone cliffs. The curved and undulating mountain ridges made the distant horizon look equally twisted. Above them was the light gray sky, and below them was the vast and endless valley. The sun poured down on the cliffs on the other side of the valley, and similarly carved the shadow of the mountain they were on. Far away in the mountain stream, some unknown bird of prey was circling, occasionally letting out a sharp howl that echoed between the mountains. The young prince whispered to them that it was a gray falcon, a bird of prey that only lived in the Grey Mountains. Only then did Brando remember that this place was very close to Haru's hometown. If one could look past the vast mountains, one would be able to see the lowlands where the people of Beale had lived for generations, and the vast plains to the north. On the plains, there were scattered hills and black pine forests, and there was also a huge capital. He asked the young prince if he had chosen this path when he escaped, and the young prince said yes. But at that time they left in a carriage under the cover of night. Entering the Grey Mountains in the dark of night, he felt uneasy. The pitch-black mountains were like sleeping beasts, and it left a deep impression on him. But now that he was with his teacher, he naturally did not have to be afraid anymore. The young prince's words made everyone laugh. In addition to Brando and the Roman, there was also Magadol, Dilfrey, and Maynard. The nun princess and the countess were the original owners of this carriage, while the merchant lady and the young prince squeezed in. It was not that the young lady did not have her own carriage, but Dilfrey's carriage had a special charcoal brazier, so the sneaky young lady thought of this from the beginning and tried to coax the soft-hearted countess to invite them into the carriage. Fortunately, the countess did not mind at all. She was more than happy to have a few more people to chat with. The young Roman chattered and had endless stories, most of which were made up, which was to Dilfrey's liking. Thus the two of them became good friends in no time. Only Princess Magadol stood by the side and listened with a slight smile, as if she had no intention of getting involved in the conversation. She only spoke occasionally when asked, but every word she said was meaningful, showing the demeanor of the nun princess of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The carriage rolled on for a while and there was a knock on the carriage door. Brando opened the door and a gust of cold wind blew in from the outside, causing the temperature in the carriage to drop by a few degrees. Of course, Maynard was an exception. The female knight sat beside Haruz with her hands on the brass hilt of her sword, her long eyelashes drooping as she counted the tassels on the carriage's curtain. Yuta's weathered face appeared outside the carriage door. The former female mercenary leader and current captain of the White Lion Guards was sitting on horseback, parallel to the carriage. When she saw Brando open the door, she bowed slightly and said to him, "My lord, Fort Tisco is in front. So we've already arrived." Brando asked the carriage to slow down, then jumped off and closed the door. As soon as he set foot on the land of the Grey Mountain, he suddenly felt a sense of reality. This was the first time since he came to this world that he had crossed Ampere Seal and come to the land of the north. He seemed to remember the scene of running and fighting with everyone on this land. He couldn't help but subconsciously look back at the carriage, but through the foggy window, he couldn't see the expression on the face behind the window. At this time, the female mercenary leader had already brought him a warhorse from behind. He silently took the reins from Yuta's hand, flipped onto the horse and then asked casually, "How is it? Are you used to the land of the north?" Yuta was a little surprised by the way her lord spoke like a master. She wiped the frost on her eyebrows, shook her head and said with a somewhat amused tone, "My lord, I'm more familiar with this land than you are." Brando was slightly stunned and looked back at his subordinate, as if he just remembered that he had never asked about their origins. "You're from the Grey Mountain? You can say that. Before my sister's accident, we lived in Corvado for a period of time. That experience made me hate the nobles to the core. Sometimes I think that if only I woke up earlier. But forget it, I don't want to talk about these things anymore." Yuta suddenly sighed, looking at the undulating mountains with waning interest. Brando nodded and did not ask any more questions. Yuta was the leader of his guards, but she was not the best choice. The most suitable person was actually Koden, but the old man was determined not to interfere in Tanajal's affairs anymore. After Count Randner was imprisoned, He bought a piece of land near Menta, as if he was determined to be a carefree manor owner or an old farmer. However, Koden still recommended Yuta to him. Out of the 5 mercenary leaders under him, Reto deliberately distanced himself from the core of power in Abes, and only wanted the refugees from Fortress Reden to live a better life. Karglais and the others privately called him the leader of the refugees, and the Red-Beard Badam was infatuated with local law and order, as if he was satisfied with just being a magistrate. He once admitted that he did not have any great ambitions, and his current life was already his goal. Brando did not intend to force these 2 mercenary leaders to follow him since the beginning. Besides, he knew that Badam's abilities were limited, and being a magistrate was already the best he could do. The other 3 mercenary leaders who joined later were even more ambitious. Cornelius became Amandina's subordinate and was responsible for the logistics of the territory's army. Rabin had already made a name for himself in the White Lion Guards, and his military experience in the Karsuk Highlands made him the most comfortable in Brando's army. After the Autumn Twilight War, he became another important assistant to Karglais. Karglais intended to let him command a cavalry unit, but the unit had not been formed yet. Only Yuta's vision seemed to be limited by her experience as a mercenary leader. She was considered outstanding when she was a mercenary leader, but after joining the White Lion Guards, her performance was very ordinary. Amandina appreciated the experience and loyalty of these mercenary leaders, and wanted to give them a better position. Rabin and Cornelius were able to accept it, but Yuta's position was awkward. She did not want to rely on her relationship with Amandina to climb up the ranks, so she was only a small infantry leader in the White Lion Guards. When he received the mission and wanted to find a commander who was capable of commanding a small group, Jana immediately entered his sights. Koden had also suggested that Jana's experience would be extremely useful in commanding a mercenary group that was made up of multiple professions and different types of soldiers. Of course, he actually had a better choice, and that was Freya. However, it was a waste of talent to let Freya be the leader of the diplomatic group. More importantly, she had just gained some reputation in the kingdom, and now she needed to stay and strengthen her position in the southern army. On the other hand, he and Maynard were going to the Empire, and the princess needed a loyal general by her side. Freya stayed in Erewhon to partner with Amandina, Karglais and Cohen, who was far away in Silman, so he could be more assured of the situation in the south. Even if the old nobles wanted to use this opportunity to stir up trouble, the princess and Tanajil would not be in immediate danger. Furthermore, he left behind the Tree Elves and the White Lion Guards, so that Freya would have enough military power to use. Because of this consideration, he finally chose Yuta, and was very satisfied with her performance. In this diplomatic group he brought along Medisha, the Shire, Hipamra, the Nightsong Tigers mercenary group, the White Lion Guards that belonged to Mars, a few hundred steel golems, a few flying gargoyles, a few witches for Valkyries, and a lady who could not be seen in public. She used her experience to arrange these different people, different soldiers, and different war machines well. In addition to the White Lion Guards and the Nightsong Tigers mercenary group, Brando hoped that the steel golems and gargoyles provided by the Buga people could be hidden, and of course the witches and Valkyries should not be seen in public. Yuta divided the troops into 2 groups and specially designed a marching route for them. She was very experienced in how to travel in the mountains and not get lost. Many of the routes she designed were used by Brando in the game in his previous life, and Brando was full of praise for them. After more than a week of travel, Brando could completely confirm that it was a waste of talent to let this lady be an infantry leader. Some people were born to be mercenary leaders, elite division commanders, and Yuta was no doubt such a talent. Then Brando looked up at the long line of people on the narrow mountain road. It was mainly made up of 5 carriages. The first carriage in front carried the envoys of Count Eek and Count Janalesu. The second carriage carried the meatball son of Duke Karsuk. The third carriage carried the daughter of Duke Viro and the 7 or 8-year-old little girl of the Grinoires family, and the fourth carriage was the carriage of a certain merchant lady. These carriages were all accompanied by several attendants, and the White Lion Guards, which made the originally narrow mountain road very congested. This was because Brando had wisely placed the hundreds of envoys at the back of the convoy, leaving only a small group of cavalry in front to open the road. Otherwise they would have blocked the mountain road and would not be able to move. In front of this bloated group, the shadow of a wall had appeared. This wall stretched across the mountain road, and one side of the dark tower was close to the steep mountain wall, and the other side seemed to be hanging over a deep cliff. From afar it was awe-inspiring. This was Fort Tisco, the most important pass from Cypher to Corvado. Brando had been here a few times in the game in his previous life, but because of the presence of players, The atmosphere of the fort in the game was not as solemn as it was in the game. It was much livelier, and he remembered that there was a spontaneous market formed by players on this mountain road. He led Yuta forward through the crowd until they came to the bottom of the wall. Medisha and the Shire were already waiting for them, and there was also the meatball son of Duke Karsuk, who looked like he was rolling on the ground. After so many days, Brando had figured out how to pronounce this guy's awkward name, Avram or Auguste. When Avram saw Brando, he could not help but complain loudly to him, saying that this remote place was full of ignorant country bumpkins who insisted on seeing the Count in person, and that they did not give him any face at all. Brando had long been immune to this level of complaint, but he still had some doubts in his heart. Generally speaking, these soldiers would not easily offend nobles. After all, in this era, there were not many who dared to pretend to be nobles. According to Avram, either someone was deliberately making things difficult for them, or something had happened in the fort. He cast a questioning look at Medisha and the Shire. The little elven princess frowned and replied softly, "Judging from their tone, it seems like there's a thief in the fort. There are not only soldiers and officers in this fortress, but there are also their families and villagers living nearby. It's not like this place is too big or too small. It's not like there are only soldiers and officers in this fortress. There are also their families and villagers living nearby. It's not like this place is too big or too small. If there's a burglar, then this place has to be guarded for 365 days in a year, and 24 hours a day." However, the Shire was obviously more familiar with the ways of the world. He hurriedly explained with a smile, "My lord, I've asked. I'm afraid that Mr. Avram has misunderstood something. I heard that the thief stole something from the owner of this place. That's why the situation is like this." Brando finally understood. A nobleman, especially a military one, was actually patronized by a thief in his own territory. Anyone would be furious if they were in his place. Although in many of Erwin's village stories, stories about the thief of God and the nightingale were exaggerated to the extreme, and these incarnations of justice seemed to be specifically targeting the nobles. They were chivalrous and they robbed the rich to help the poor. But in fact, those who really understood this business would understand that most of these gray areas that made a living in a certain place were actually inextricably linked to the nobles. This was not to say that the nobles secretly supported these people's work, but it was precisely to protect the nobles' rights and interests from being infringed upon. Most of the time, the nobles were well aware of how many thieves there were in the area, and what the identity of these thieves were. Other than that, the nobles basically minded their own business. Therefore, the person who committed this crime was definitely an outsider. But Brando was curious and he wondered who was so daring. Soon, the guards verified their identities, lowered the drawbridge and opened the gate, allowing them to enter the fortress. Brando stared at the slowly rising gate, and he knew that the so-called identity verification was just a pretense. Most of the time before this was just to report to the Viscount. The guards below were unwilling to bear the responsibility, so they asked the Viscount to personally let them pass. But what Brando did not know was that the daring bandit he muttered was really a local and not an outsider. Inside Castle Tisco, 2 carriages were parked under the shade of a tree. Although the so-called shade was only left with a few lonely withered leaves, they still hadn't fallen to the ground. Outside the carriages there were many servants. At first glance, these servants didn't look like those who came from the countryside. Although they looked bright and clean, they looked lazy at first glance, as if they still had the habit of idling around before they became nobles' servants. These servants were well trained. Their masters did not open the door to get down from the carriage, so they stood in 2 rows in front of the carriages. They did not say a word and looked straight ahead, like 2 rows of puppets that were about to take root on the ground. As for the 2 carriages, the emblem on one had been removed, and the coat of arms on the other was a black wolf. In fact, the wolf emblem alone was enough to stop anyone in Castle Tisk, because it was the emblem of the Grey Mountain family. 2 young people were sitting in the carriage. To be exact, 2 young ladies. One was a 17 or 18 years old noble lady, and the other was a young girl with curly hair under a huge scholar's hat and thick glasses, like an old pedant. However, she was very short, like a dwarf, and even her breasts had not started to develop. At first glance, it was obvious that she was a real lowly, and judging from her age she seemed to be no more than 11 or 12 years old. The 2 were obviously talking, but what was surprising was that the one who led the conversation was the little girl who looked like she had not even changed her teeth yet. She said, so slow, I hate people who are not punctual." The noble lady was obviously worried and asked carefully, "Chiara, they seem to have found something missing." "Of course they will find it," the lowly replied matter-of-factly. "That Viscount is not an idiot." But won't we get into trouble? Troublesome? Of course not. Chiara spun a card-like object in her hand and looked at it with interest. I'm just a little interested in this thing. Would he dare to disobey me if I asked him to give it to me? I just don't want to owe him a favor, so I had to do it myself. Besides, things like mistakes and whatnot have not appeared in my dictionary. Chapter 905. While the two were talking, a servant knocked on the carriage door and reported, "Miss, the envoy group has arrived." They entered the city from the Stone Lizard Mountain path. They were delayed for a while because of the martial law. The little girl knocked on the table in the middle of the carriage and said, "It seems that guy has arrived. Chiara, should we go?" The count's daughter asked softly, but the little girl's attitude was firm. She quickly shook her head and said, "No, we will wait here. Let me see if that guy is boring." Although the count's daughter had a gentle look on her face, she was no fool. She could naturally tell that her companion was deliberately making things difficult for the count. She could also vaguely guess the reason and could not help but ask more worriedly, "Chiara, this isn't very good." "Why is it not good?" The little girl pretended to be indifferent. "But he is the leader of the envoy group after all. So what? If that guy dares to scold me with a straight face, I won't go to the Empire." The little girl was very dissatisfied. "You won't go to the Empire?" The count's daughter showed a shocked expression. "What are you afraid of, Enide? When the time comes, you can stay at my house for a while. I will complain to my brother. Your father won't dare to do anything to us." The little girl replied. The count's daughter opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she knew that she could not persuade her companion. She could only sit there uneasily as if she had accepted her fate. The carriage was quiet for a while. The two people each had different feelings as they waited for Brando's arrival. The count's daughter only hoped that the count would not vent his anger on her. She was worried about her gains and losses and could not help but be worried for a while. The little girl sitting opposite her did not seem to care. She gently tapped the window with her finger while looking at the scenery outside. After Brando entered the city, he received a message from a servant. He already knew that the representatives of House Cipher and Count Grey Mountain were already in the city. However, he first arranged for the diplomatic group to stay in an inn in the fortress before heading to the appointed location alone. When he arrived at the agreed location, he saw the two carriages parked under the oak tree from afar, as well as 2 rows of servants standing beside the carriages. He walked over and revealed his identity to these people, thinking that he would be able to see the 2 representatives. However, he did not expect that the servant who passed on the message would walk back the way he came not long after he reached the carriages, bringing back a message with a poker face. The young lady heard that the count is knowledgeable. In order to prove the count's identity, she wants to test some of the count's knowledge. Brando couldn't help but be stunned. Was there something wrong with this noble lady's head? How could she verify one's identity like this? Could it be that the princess's royal ring was fake? He glanced at the carriage and thought to himself, forget it. After all, she is a member of the royal family, even though she is a former royal family, and she is a girl. It's not good to be too calculative. He could only answer patiently, "Please speak." Chiara's little face was almost pressed against the window. She said with a little pride, "I have long heard that the guy boasted of being knowledgeable. The rumors about him in the Southern Territory are amazing. I've seen a lot of people like him. It's just a golden exterior. To them, knowledge is just a disguise and gorgeous clothes. Let me expose his hypocritical appearance. I will let him understand that the search for the truth is sacred and cannot be profaned." The count's daughter could almost see herself being punished for bringing trouble to her family. The small house where she was confined swayed in front of her. She asked worriedly, "What questions did you ask him, Chiara?" "Hee," the little girl smiled slyly. She pushed her thick glasses and replied with some pride, "Nothing, just some ancient words." Enide stared at her suspiciously. She wondered if her companion would really be so soft-hearted. "Sure enough," the little girl said, "but these words were found on some stone slabs by a friend of my teacher. In order to unearth those stone slabs, my teacher and I stayed in the cold and boring Balta Plateau for a long time. My teacher is an authority in the field of ancient languages, but even he couldn't recognize all the words on those stone slabs. Just wait and see how that guy embarrasses himself." Enide knew who the little girl's teacher was. She thought that since even the master couldn't recognize all the slabs, it wouldn't be embarrassing even if the count couldn't recognize them. Of course, she didn't dare to say this out loud in case the young lady changed her mind at the last minute. Outside the carriage, Brando was taking a piece of paper from the servant. He glanced at the tadpole-like ancient words on the paper and couldn't help but laugh. Isn't this the content of the ancient stone slabs? The first clue of the war slate. These stone slabs were the clues he provided to Tolman, which allowed people to unearth them in advance in this era. It was fine if it was something else, but it just had to be the words on the stone slabs. The words on the stone slabs were once a hot topic on the forum. In the end, it was translated by a level 16 ancient language master in their guild who wore A+3 language skill divine artifact, Necklace of Knowledge. He could even recite it with his eyes closed. He put down the paper and without even thinking, he said to the servant in front of him, "Tell your mistress that the fragments of the sky fell to the ground with the collapse of the towering pillars." It recorded the whispers in the dust and wind. A few minutes later, Kiara, did the count guess correctly? Enid looked at her companion worriedly. She had been staring at the contents of the paper for a long time without moving. "You didn't guess." The little girl dropped this sentence and jumped out of the carriage. She pushed away the servant who came to support her and hurriedly ran out. Brando didn't expect that the person who came out of the carriage would be such a little girl who seemed to still be in the process of growing her teeth. In standard villain lines, she was a little girl with yellow hair who was still wet behind the ears. The other party was wearing a pair of thick bottle-bottomed glasses that didn't match her cute face. She looked at him with a frown and asked, "Hey, how did you recognize these words? Does she still care about aristocratic etiquette? This little lady, may I ask who you are?" Brando was a little unhappy at first, but when he found that the person who tested him was such a little girl, he was no longer angry. No matter how bored he was, he wouldn't be so bored as to argue with a child. Kiara seemed to have realized her rudeness at this time, but she snorted softly and replied, "Count Djiu is my father, Queen Anna is my aunt, my brother is Levin? Or Nessun. Duke Cypher, you should know who I am by now, right? What kind of messy relationship is this?" Brando looked at the arrogant little girl for a while before he sorted out his thoughts and asked, "You are the representative of House Cypher?" "It's the former royal family," the little girl corrected. "More or less, but I don't want to go to the Empire. Can you persuade me?" What a spoiled little girl, Brando thought to himself. He shook his head and said, "I can't persuade you. How about this, you go back first? The eldest son of the king is a generous person, he probably won't blame his sister." "You're really strange, you actually call my brother the eldest son of the king. It's not proper for you to call him that, you know? Aren't you afraid that the princess will cause trouble for you?" "Oh, I know." The little girl's eyes flashed and she replied proudly, "You don't care about that little princess at all, right? How about you support Levin to take the throne? The house of Covardo has already lost its sword, so it's natural for it to lose the throne. History is a cycle, and the house of Cypher is already at the time of its revival. Besides, my brother is much more powerful than that princess of yours. That little princess only knows how to sell herself for a good price, marry a good husband and revive the house of Covardo. She's very superficial. The revival of a country can't be decided by just one family. How about it, I promise you that in the future, you won't just be a count but people will call you a duke." If it was someone else who said those words to Brendel would have definitely punched that person to the ground, unable to get up. But it was a little lowly with a childish voice who was advising him in such a serious manner. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. This little girl had not even changed all her teeth, but she kept calling Griffin a little lass as if Griffin, who was already 17 years old, was still wet behind the ears in her eyes. "Miss, if you don't want to go to the Empire, I can write a letter for you to prove that you're not feeling well. As for the rest, I'm really not interested in discussing it." Brando could only answer like this. But the little girl didn't seem to appreciate it. She shook her head and said, "I'm fine. I don't need you to write a letter for me. Besides, you haven't told me why you can read those words. I must find a way to figure it out." "All right, as you wish." Brando shook his head. "Didn't you say that you don't want to go to the Empire? How can you go back on your words?" But Chiara seemed to see the disapproving look on his face. She snorted softly and said, "I don't want to go to the Empire and I want to go to the Empire. There's no contradiction between that." After that, she turned around and ran back to the carriage. She rudely used her hands and feet to climb up the mountain and said loudly to the count's daughter who was sitting on the carriage, "Enid, I've changed my mind. I'm going to the Empire. You go back alone." "No need, Chiara. I'll go with you." The count's daughter wanted to cry but had no tears. When did she say that she wanted to go back? But Chiara's words finally made her feel relieved. Fortunately, at least she didn't have to go back home and be confined. Although she didn't know why the young lady suddenly changed her mind, The Count's daughter couldn't help but have an indescribable good impression of the Count Tonagel whom she had never met before. Thank God Martha was above. She secretly drew a god's mark on her chest. After Chiara and the Count's daughter returned to the team, the people who had been traveling for days enjoyed a rare night in the hotel where they could sleep peacefully. Although the incident of the Viscount being burgled in the city caused an uproar, after all, it had nothing to do with them. Although the guards probably couldn't wait to arrest all the merchants who had some assets in the city and then claim that they had cooperated to commit the crime, and then confiscate their property, they didn't dare to provoke this team with a strong background. The delegation stayed in Fort Tisco for half a day and a night, and set off early the next morning. It was said that the Viscount didn't find the mysterious burglar until the end, so the area around the Grey Mountain was filled with the legend of a mysterious nightingale for a long time. At first, the image of this nightingale was like that of a god in the sky, but later no one knew how she got involved with the Count of Tonagel. Some people even swore that they saw the Count steal the Viscount's things with their own eyes, as if he was there when Brando was committing the crime. Over time, the image of this nightingale gradually spread to the image of a wise and astute little girl, but no matter which image it was, what they did was to rob the rich to help the poor, as if they couldn't find anything more meaningful to do every day, regardless of whether they had enough to eat every day. As for the things that the Viscount lost, there were many different opinions. Some said that it was a ton of gold or a diamond the size of a fist. Some exaggerated said that it was evidence of the Viscount's treason with the enemy. Most of the people who harbored such malicious thoughts had some kind of enmity with the Viscount, but there was a general consensus that these things, if only they could get their hands on them, how good would that be? As it turned out, most people did not have the noble character to be a hero. After leaving Fort Tisco, the diplomatic group headed north, but they did not enter Corvado. Instead, they crossed the border between the Grey Mountain and the Balta Plateau, braving the biting cold wind of the Ironthorn Mountain Road as they approached the kingdom's border day after day. After leaving the Grey Mountain area, there were endless mountains. There were no longer any human settlements in the vast rolling mountains. 3 days later, they passed by the vicinity of Winterclaw Fort. It could be said that they had bid farewell to the last area closest to civilization before reaching the Empire. After that was the snowy region that no one set foot in all year round, a natural forbidden zone between the Empire and the kingdom. Haruz told them some terrible legends about this region, such as the soft sounds in the wind at night were the whispers of the undead on the plateau, and the terrible wolf-like creatures on the plateau. He and his sister had lived in Winterclaw Fort for quite a long time, so he knew some of the local folklore very well. However, these stories scared the ladies in the diplomatic group so much that they did not sleep well for a few nights. After that, Brando and the young prince became unwelcome guests in each carriage. For Brando it was an unexpected disaster. These days, Chiara had been pestering Brando to find out why he knew the meaning of the ancient words. Of course, Brando could not come up with a lie like, "If you are all cavemen, then I am at least a Homo sapiens from the future." However, during a casual conversation when the little girl from House Cypher asked about his master, he, as usual, used the excuse that he learned from the Bugas. Unexpectedly, this excuse worked wonders. After that, Chiara disappeared and hid in his carriage with the Count's daughter all day long. It was only later that Brando found out that she was plotting how to steal the knowledge of the Bugas from him. This so-called truth made him want to cry, but no tears came out. The others in the diplomatic group were not as hard-working as the eldest daughter of House Cypher. Except for Iko and the sergeant from Janalesu, most of the noble descendants who lived like princes began to complain since they entered Balta. Then they began to fall ill one after another. The first one was the meatball Mr. Ephraim. Because he was greedy for some unclean game, of course he asked his servant to find a way to find it, he began to vomit and have diarrhea. Fortunately, there were still clerics in the diplomatic group who took a day or two to calm him down. Then it was the 7 or 8-year-old little girl from Duke Grenoir's family who had a high fever. In the end, Brando, the leader, seemed to have played the role of a nanny. Although it sounded good to let the little girl hold his hand and call him brother with teary eyes, the price was that he did not sleep well for a few days. After the diplomatic group crossed the last mountain on the border of Balta, everything seemed to have quieted down involuntarily. Because everyone knew that the fortress of the Black Sword was in front of them. Since the beginning of the last era, that was the gateway to the Empire, the last checkpoint in the north of the kingdom. Majestic mountains traversed the north and south, connecting the two kingdoms together. In the southeast of the Empire, there was a huge mountain range, part of the White Mountain Range. This mountain range traversed the entire southern part of Saint Tassol. At the end of the west, it crossed the southernmost part of the wilderness of the Four Territories, forming an undulating mountain range. In the center of the mountain range there was snow all year round, and there were even many large and small black forests. This was a paradise for archaeologists and explorers. The Dirut Mountains were named after the first Wind Elf king. To the west of the mountains was the famous Anzaruda region. This name alone may be confusing, but it had another name, the home of the Highlanders, the home of the Longblade Lords. To the east of the Dirut Mountains was the starry Abyssal Sea. Along the coast of the Abyssal Sea were duchies and kingdoms of various sizes. Antaburo was one of them. To the north was the famous wilderness of the Four Territories, the four-leaf grass plains, the birthplace of the Wind Elves and the Cruise people. At the same time, it was also the place where the Sacred Covenant was made. The Balta Plateau was just the southern tip of this famous mountain range. The mountain range gradually leveled off in the direction of the Corvado Plains, and together with the eastern end of the Broken Sword Mountains, it formed a famous mountain pass. This was the Fortress of the Black Sword. On this day the diplomatic group finally saw the insignificant fortress between the two peaks from the high ground. But everyone knew that when you really came to the fortress, you would be deeply shocked by the wall that was more than 20 meters tall. That was the Imperial Wall. Chapter 906. In the wilderness south of Anzaruda and the border between Balta and Anzaruda, most of the undulating ridges only had this kind of dark rock. There was little vegetation, and the higher elevations were covered with white snow all year round. Below, there was only sparse Eurasian heather or similar shrubs that formed a tundra grassland, scattered on the ground like a thin layer of volcanic ash. A majestic fortress stood between the two dark mountains. The walls were more than 60 feet high and were made of square stones. The Empire's flag fluttered on the 4 watchtowers. From these towering towers, one could easily monitor every valley within a radius of 10 miles. The observation room was also equipped with rotating ballistas and wizards. There was also more than a squadron of crossbowmen, who could shoot the enemy from the air through the holes in the towers. The fortress was also equipped with an air force. The Frontier Legion stationed here had griffins and wyverns, as well as elite Pegasus Knight. They would ascend to the sky as soon as possible after confirming the enemy's situation, guarding the airspace above the fortress. Brando withdrew his gaze from the huge iron cages on the walls. Those were the Griffins' cages. The Griffins locked in them were the air force of the early warning unit on the walls. They could be used for reconnaissance and interception. Not far from those iron cages was a towering giant door. This giant door was more than 50 feet high from the ground to the top. It opened in the middle and was completely made of cast iron. In order to cast this iron door, the Cruise craftsmen used precast iron workpieces to assemble it together. The wizards used magic to mix them together. The purpose of casting this iron door was to fully unleash the impact of the dragon cavalry inside the fortress. There were 2 regiments of dragon cavalry inside the Black Sword Fortress. When the Cruise needed them, they would let the dragon cavalry line up behind the door and open the main door to attack the enemy outside the fortress. The flat slope outside the Black Sword Fortress was also artificially paved. It was originally a steep valley, but it was filled up by Duke Semple and turned into what it was now. Romaine stood beside him, holding his arm tightly with her little hand. She was also looking up at the majestic wall. She slightly opened her mouth and sighed. "It's so high, Brando." The outer walls of the Black Sword Fortress were raised during the Year of Glory. Before that, the main wall was no more than 35 feet high, not much different from the outer walls of Monsteros. During the Year of Frost, the Highlanders led by the Longblade Lord attacked this place with the support of the Erwin. During the Year of the Tiger Lizard, the Cruise recaptured this fortress and began to rebuild it. The construction of the stronghold lasted for 30 years. It wasn't until the Year of Summer when Duke Semple completed the front ramp that the stronghold was completed. Brando explained to her. This knowledge was not rare for a veteran player, but the little Roman was stunned. She had never heard of this before, but after hearing the words of the person beside her, she felt that Brando was the most knowledgeable person in the world. She was a little proud but also very curious. "Can someone really conquer this place, Brando? This wall is so high, can they climb it?" Even though the Black Sword Fortress isn't the strongest fortress in the Empire, it's still one of the best in the southern regions of the Empire. However, this city has indeed been attacked by Aween's people twice in history. The first time was during the war when King Eric helped the Highlanders capture Anzaruda. The second time was more recently, during the Walnut Rebellion about 100 years ago. At that time, the Highland Knights of Balta captured this fortress after repelling the invasion of the Empire. Chiara seemed to have heard the conversation between the two and snorted softly. That was the time when the Corvado dynasty was at its strongest, but unfortunately, it was still too weak. If it were me, I would not return this fortress to the Kurluts. I would either give it to the Lion Beastmen or the Wind Elves so that the kingdom would not have to face the threat from the north. Brando directly turned a blind eye to the childish talk. He noticed that the other envoys were also curious about this matter. He nodded and replied, "That is indeed the case. The Black Sword Fortress was first built in the year of Moss of the Chaos Era. It was completed at the beginning of the First Era. In history it has only been conquered twice, and both times were accomplished by the Erewhon. That is because other countries would not take a detour to attack the Empire from Erewhon's territory." Kiara curled her lips and replied. The fat man Ephraim asked curiously, "Leader, do you mean that our Erewhon actually defeated the Empire?" "What do you mean?" Brando was stunned. "What I mean is, leader, how could Erewhon defeat the Empire? You must be mistaken, right?" The fat man said loudly as if he had heard a funny joke. Brando was almost angered to death by his words. He replied snappily, "Why do you think that Erewhon has never defeated the Empire?" He did not even have the strength to look down on this guy's ignorant historical knowledge. Let's not talk about the large and small battles in the past hundreds of years. Although the Cruz Empire was strong, they were not invincible. There were many examples of them being defeated by the Erewhon. Less than 5 months ago, he had beaten the Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Empire's expeditionary fleet in Ampere Seal and taught them a lesson. Yet this guy ignored this war. He could not help but feel depressed. He could not help but wonder what this guy, as a descendant of nobles, had learned in Karsuk. However, Ephraim was still stubborn. He spread out his hands and asked, "But the Empire is so big. Erewhon is just a small country at the border. It can't even compare to a province of the Empire. How can we defeat them?" "Commander, I don't believe you when you say that we, the people of Oween, have defeated the Kurluts before. There are many such examples in history. In fact, it's just a small conflict and they claim it as a great victory. I've seen this kind of thing many times in Karsuk. My friends in the patrol team often do this kind of thing. The glory that the royal family preaches must not be fully believed. It's just to maintain the legitimacy of their rule." Comparing the patrol cavalry of this era to the Highland Knight of the War of Walnut, this idea was very avant-garde. Brando could not help but marvel at this guy's way of thinking. He could not help but answer, "In that case, why do you think we are standing here today representing Erewhon to the Empire? The Kurlutzians would never ask their provinces to send envoys to pay tribute to His Majesty." Ephraim obviously did not consider this question. He was stunned by Brando's question and could not help but frown and think hard. At this time, Duke Viro's daughter, the 17 or 18-year-old girl, spoke up, "I think it's because the Empire doesn't need a remote place like Oween. Other than our kingdom, aren't there many other kingdoms and duchies under the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and the Empire hasn't made a move against them either. My teacher often told me that if the Empire had the heart, Erewhon would have become an autonomous region like Anzaruta. By then we would all be nobles of the Empire. Am I right, Count?" "Yes, my foot. That damn teacher of yours better not let me meet him," Brando said in his heart. But when he looked at the expressions of the other people in the diplomatic group, he found that except for outsiders like the Roman, Medicia, and Hippamera, most of them seemed to agree with this statement. Of course, those who truly understood the history of the kingdom were excluded. For example, the Shire and Chiara, both of them had a look of disdain on their faces. What made Brando curious was that he saw a similar look on Yuta's face. At this time, Chiara finally could not hold it in anymore. After all, she was a former member of the royal family. Upholding the legitimacy of the kingdom was also upholding the reputation of her family. She coldly sneered, "The war between the Empire and the Erewhon Empire since the end of the Dragon Age was also a good show. It was so that the Erewhon Empire could become independent from the Empire and establish our own kingdom. The nobles of the Cruz Empire are rich in the spirit of helping others. They sent the late King Erewhon Empire out of the wilderness of the Four Realms. We really should thank them properly, right?" Her sharp sarcasm startled everyone. Only then did Avram realize that he had somehow offended this young lady. Duke Viro's daughter opened her mouth and finally answered, "Isn't that because the Wind Elves are helping us?" Brando saw Chiara's little face as dark as the bottom of a pot and could not help but shake his head. He did not know when the nobles of the kingdom had lost their backbone. During the era when the Highland Knight of Balta still existed, during the year of the Walnut, the Empire was never a problem for the Erewhon. The problem was whether the people of Erewhon still dared to fight. That was all. He could not help but think of Ebden. The White Knight's predecessor was a Highland Knight of Balta. Since then, for nearly 100 years, the nobles of Erewhon seemed to have suddenly lost their spirit. They could no longer raise their heads in front of the people of Cruz. But he did not expect the nobles' imagination of the Cruz Empire to be so absurd. When Avram first spoke, he thought that he was just an exception. After all, this guy looked like a scion of a rich family. He was the typical example of an ignorant and incompetent person. But when Duke Viro's daughter opened her mouth to speak, he sensed that something was wrong. Although this little girl usually behaved normally, he could tell that she was a well-educated person. She also knew a lot about foreign affairs and etiquette. She obviously knew about the history of the kingdom, but like Avram, she didn't agree with this history. There were too many differences between this history and what they saw now. He shook his head for the second time and answered his nominal subordinates. Although the empire is strong, it is not without enemies. Although Erewhon is small, the empire cannot spare all its energy to deal with us. The empire has Fanzan in the north, Saint Tassol and Madara in the east, and Hazel and Toquinen in the west. In the face of so many enemies, it is impossible for the empire to spare the strength of a province to deal with us. Moreover, in the south there is Anzaruda. Since the time of the Long-Blade Lord, the Highlanders have dreamed of independence for nearly 7 centuries. The empire should be thankful that we do not make trouble for them. How would they dare to make a move in the south? Therefore, the empire actually wants to maintain this relationship with us. On the one hand, they are still unwilling to acknowledge the establishment of Erewhon because of the honor of the empire. On the other hand, they are unable to really make a move in the south. Even in the War of Walnut, our opponent was only the Duke of Walnut. In the end, we were actually helping the empire to quell the rebellion. Erewhon's position is so sensitive and special that the Wind Elves and the empire do not dare to act rashly. Relying on this delicate balance, the late King Eric found his own path that belonged to Erewhon. At this point he glanced at Chiara. Anson I has obviously understood the secret between them. That is why he returned the Black Sword Fortress to Cruz after the War of Walnut. Because once the balance is broken, it may not be a good thing for Erewhon. Brando looked at the others and said word by word, "So, Erewhon does not necessarily need to defeat the entire empire, but this does not mean that Erewhon has no chance of winning. Big countries have the power of big countries and small countries have the wisdom of small countries. I am telling you all this because I want you to understand that the kingdom of Erewhon has its own unique advantages. Its nobles and people do not need to be enemies in front of the empire." After hearing this, Chiara could not help but snort softly. Obviously, she already knew this knowledge and did not need Brando to repeat it. As for the others, including Avram and Duke Viro's youngest daughter, most of them were hearing this for the first time, so they were skeptical. However, Brando did not need them to believe him completely. He just wanted to give these nobles a heads up in advance so that they would not lose face when they saw the empire's nobles. As the group was talking, they gradually approached the Black Sword Fortress. It was at this time that a loud noise came from the front, attracting everyone's attention. The noise started with a row of neat footsteps, followed by the sound of heavy horse hooves. Then, everyone saw a small group of Empire soldiers appear in their field of vision. This small group of Empire soldiers was led by 3 or 4 knights. They opened the small wooden gate beside the huge Black Sword Fortress gate, lowered the drawbridge and rushed out. The few knights shouted and suddenly ordered their men to rush towards a caravan outside the fortress. It was worth mentioning that at this time of the year, other than Brando's eye-catching group of nobles, there were also many caravans of various sizes gathered outside the fortress. As one of the only 2 gateways between the Empire and Erewhon, the Black Sword Fortress was not only a strategic military point, but also an important transportation route between the 2 countries. Throughout the year, except for the 1 or 2 months after the winter harp month when the mountain path was completely frozen, there would be caravans passing through the fortress most of the time. At this moment, the target of the Empire soldiers was obviously the Erewhon caravan. They quickly rushed into the middle of the caravan and first knocked down the armed guards. Then they chased the merchants out of the caravan, tied their hands behind their backs and pushed them to the ground. After that, the Empire soldiers returned to the middle of the caravan and used their field swords to cut the ropes on the carriages and threw the goods on the ground one by one. Not long after, they found a lot of people from the carriages. There were men and women, old and young. The Empire soldiers herded these people together. Most of these people were dressed in ragged clothes, shivering in the cold wind. The women and children among them were so scared that they cried loudly. However, the Empire soldiers were still indifferent, and a few of them even had a sneer on their faces. At first, Brando thought that he had encountered a melodramatic scene, but he soon realized that it was not the case. But before he could say anything, the count's daughter behind him was already scared out of her wits. Miss Enide looked at the scene with a pale face and couldn't help but ask in fear, "What the hell is going on?" Seeing this scene, Chiara pursed her lips but was unwilling to speak. Among all of them, Duke Viro's daughter was more knowledgeable. She explained to the others in a low voice, "These people are refugees. So that's how it is." Brando finally understood. Ever since Erwin's royal faction lost power in the Frost upheaval, the kingdom had been in turmoil. This turmoil in the entire kingdom was manifested in the chaos of war. The struggle between the royal family and the local nobles was only a small part of it. When the central government gradually lost its binding power, the conflicts between the local lords became the first to become acute. Whether it was for the sake of competing for territory, population, or support, large and small wars always continued. This situation was not so intense in the south. On one hand, it was because of Madara. On the other hand, after the Battle of Ampere Seal, the north was temporarily assigned to the eldest son of the king. North of Cipher, the nobles seemed to have lost their order for a while. In these areas that were under the influence of the royal family of Kovardo, the royal family of Cipher, the Wind Elves, and the Holy Cathedral of Fire, war seemed to have become a daily necessity. And with the war came a large number of refugees. A small number of these refugees were accepted by Tanajil, but more of them flowed to the north, to the empire. For the empire this was not a big deal. The refugees needed to find a place to provide them with a livelihood, and the empire was happy to accept this labor force. But the problem was, with the increasing number of refugees, not only did it bring benefits to the empire, but it also brought troubles and burdens. The direction where the refugees migrated to originally had residents, and the nobles of the empire could not accept all the laborers. The remaining idle people gradually became a hidden danger to the local public security. Coupled with the fact that the arrival of these refugees harmed the interests of the local residents, over time, these refugees became synonymous with unwelcome in the empire. Since then, the people of Cruz began to refuse to accept these refugees into the country. What was happening in front of them was obviously such a scene. "Sister, what will happen to them?" Among all of them, the youngest Loli of the Grenoir's family looked at the scene with some fear and asked. "They will be treated as thieves and vagabonds, tied to a pillar here and shown to the public and then driven back." The descendants of the Erwin nobles showed some embarrassment on their faces. "What a disgrace, the face of the kingdom has been lost by these lowly people." Avram could not help but mutter angrily, "No wonder the nobles of the empire always act superior in front of us." Chapter 907. Avram wanted to say something more, but when he saw Brendel staring at him coldly, he quickly shrunk his neck and swallowed the rest of his words back into his flabby stomach. The convoy continued to move forward, passing by the Empire's soldiers and refugees. Everyone's gaze swept past the trembling men, women, and children, but most of them did not say a word. Enid and the Duke's daughter from Viro felt that the atmosphere in the convoy was a little strange. The little girl from the Grenoir's family held tightly onto her wet nurse's hand, looking a little timid. Eek, who was following closely behind Brendel, looked like he wanted to help the refugees. He kept looking at Brendel's direction but did not get permission to do so. The sergeant from Yanalasu followed behind him, one hand on the hilt of the sword hanging at his waist. His eyes were fixed on the imperial soldiers. Chiara, on the other hand, looked on coldly from the sidelines. This little girl with an extremely uncoordinated large scholar's hat stood beside Enid and watched all of this with a cold gaze that was far beyond her age. Occasionally, her expression would reveal a mocking expression towards Avram and the others. The Shire, Hippamera, and Medisha had their own thoughts, but they stood behind Brando waiting for orders. Yuta looked at the refugees and frowned slightly. She had seen too many of such scenes in this kingdom. Brando didn't even look at the refugees. His eyes didn't even linger on the imperial soldiers. He pursed his lips and led the convoy through the chaos with a cold face. The imperial knight who passed by him was ignored as if he didn't exist. Although the people in the diplomatic party had been together for almost 2 weeks, they still weren't familiar with the temperament of their commander. They only knew that he was a close vassal of Her Highness and that he was as powerful as Duke Arek in the past. Whether it was Avram or Duke Viro's daughter, most of them were warned not to offend this count who was bound to be powerful in the future. Therefore, if Brando didn't say anything, they didn't dare to act on their own. The convoy remained silent as they approached the towering gate of ebon rampart step by step. The diplomatic party quickly passed by the caravans. The refugees who were detained had long been left behind. For a moment, only Eek was still looking at the back of the convoy reluctantly. He frowned and didn't try to hide the anxiety on his face, as if he didn't understand why the Count, who he had always respected and was full of knight spirit, didn't let him do anything. However, Brando's image in his heart had already reached an unattainable height. Since Brando didn't say anything, although he was anxious, he could only stay in the convoy. He turned around and found that the little Loli from the Grenoir's family was also looking at him. She tilted her head and looked at him, her light brown eyes full of confusion. She didn't seem to understand why those people were arrested. She was only 7 or 8 years old. The world of nobles was still too far away from her. The scouts in front of the diplomatic party had already reported to the people of Cruz, so at this time, the people of Cruz also knew the origin of this noble convoy. The convoy slowly arrived at the Black Sword Fortress. Brando raised his hand to stop everyone. Not long after the convoy stopped, 3 knights of Cruz riding on land dragons came in front of them. The leading knight was wearing a silver-gray ceremonial breastplate full of shining metals. Brando saw the color of his ribbon and the long mane on his helmet and knew that this man was a knight captain. Behind him, the Grand Duke of Viro's daughter had a slight change of expression. According to the normal etiquette of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to communicate with the subordinate countries, the Empire should at least send the deputy of the highest official here to verify the identity of the official envoys and welcome them into the city. Now, Cruz sent a mere knight captain to replace them, which was blatant arrogance. This was not the first time such a thing happened. As early as 3 years ago, when Cruz's envoys went to the Empire to meet the Emperor to celebrate the New Year, they were treated like this. Perhaps even earlier than that. Long before the Year of Frost, the kingdom's envoys seemed to have been used to this kind of disrespect. But in the past, when the Grand Duke's daughter read about this from the history books, she only felt that Erwin's national strength was weak and that it was natural for a behemoth like the Empire to be superior in front of him. But now, when it was her turn to experience Cruz's disrespect, she could not help but feel a sense of resentment in her heart. But she was sensible enough not to say anything. The others in the convoy more or less felt that the atmosphere was a little strange, but except for Chiara and the Shire, the others had limited understanding of diplomatic procedures, so they could only wait silently for Brando to make a decision. Brando had already expected this. He gently patted the still ignorant Avram's shoulder and asked the meatball to submit the document. It was only then that the latter reacted. He quickly took out the document and the seal ring, and respectfully presented them to the Knight of Cruz with both hands. He was so humble that even the sergeant behind Eek could not stand it and showed a look of dissatisfaction. But the Knight of Cruz did not appreciate it. He impatiently took the document, glanced at it and then threw it back to Avram. These few movements made even the most ignorant Avram realize that the document in his hand was Erwin's letter of credence. If the other party was a marquis of the Empire's border, he would not dare to say a word even if the letter of credence was thrown back in his face. But the other party was just a small knight captain. Strictly speaking, he was not a real noble. He could not help but stare at the other party with his mouth agape. He did not understand where the other party's confidence came from. But the Knight of Cruz ignored him. He looked at the meatball with disgust and waved his hand. "Come with me." Avram stood there and did not dare to move. He subconsciously turned to look at Brando. This was no longer the etiquette that the Empire should use to welcome other countries under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Or rather, there was no etiquette at all. No matter how stupid he was, he knew that if he acted on his own initiative, the crime of a diplomatic breach would fall on his head. But the meatball found that Brando did not seem to see him and stood there motionless. Helpless, he could only tremble with fear and said to the Knight of Cruz, "Sir Knight, this doesn't seem to be in accordance with the rules?" He hoped that it was a moment of carelessness on the part of the people of Cruz and forgot about diplomatic etiquette. But to his disappointment, the knight looked at him coldly. "It's a time of war now. We can't open the knight's gate to welcome you. If you are not satisfied with anything, you can choose to take a detour or go back the way you came." Note: the Knight's Gate was the name given by Duke Semple to the front gate of the fortress in honor of the soldiers of Cruz who died in this fortress. Go back the way you came? Avram was sweating profusely. At this moment he had really seen the arrogance of the Kurlutzians. He used to think that this was natural. This world respected strength, and the Kurlutzians' fists were big and hard enough, so showing such an attitude was tolerable. But when he enjoyed this arrogance he realized how hateful it was. If he could, he wanted to punch the guy in front of him in the face and then throw a punch at the damn Count Tonigel's face. Of course this was just a thought. Even if he had 10 times the courage he wouldn't have the guts to do it. But when he was in a dilemma, Brando finally opened his mouth. "Avram, tell him that we can't go back." Avram's voice was holy. He hurriedly looked back at the people of Cruz. The knight seemed to have expected this. He couldn't help but smile contemptuously. Then please follow me, Sir Envoys. He deliberately emphasized the word, Sir Envoys. Coupled with his heavy Cruz accent, his words were full of sarcasm. This sentence made Avram's heart tremble. He was afraid that the arrogant commander would not be able to hold back his sarcasm. Other than him, the other people in the envoy group also frowned, especially Count Janelace's right-hand man behind Eek. As a soldier, his right hand was already tightly gripping the hilt of his sword. Although Avram was famous for being a hedonistic aristocrat in Karsuk, he still had the ability to observe people's expressions. Naturally, he could sense the tense atmosphere. He wiped his sweat and kept glancing at Brando. He wanted the Count to make a statement, whether he was dead or alive. But unfortunately, Brando still stood there motionlessly as if he didn't hear the words of the Knight of Cruz. This time, the Knight of Cruz finally realized that something was wrong. He directly ignored the fatty in front of him and raised his head to look at Brando strangely. He realized that this was the leader of these Erewhon people. Although he didn't know who the other party was, it didn't stop him from speaking. He replied with some arrogance, "What's the matter, everyone? Are you going to stay here forever?" Brando glanced at the guy. He had already gotten used to the arrogant faces of these Cruz people in his previous life. Central nobles like Veronica, Lenoret, and Brund were slightly better, but these Cruz soldiers at the border had more chances to interact with the Erewhon people. It was as if the trembling refugees and the Erewhon nobles had already spoiled their temper. Therefore, this group of people was almost the most arrogant group of people in the empire. In their eyes, the Erewhon people were only a little higher than beasts. This attitude became especially obvious after the First War of the Black Rose. Later, during the period of Erewhon's resurgence, it even affected the Cruz players. Dealing with the Cruz Empire of that era was simply a matter of infuriating for the Erewhon players. Compared to the past, this attitude was still considered good. At least, he did not openly mock and ridicule Roland. But Brendel did not feel the slightest bit of gratitude just because of this better attitude, because he was here to look for trouble. To other people, going to the Empire as an ambassador was to participate in the mobilization ceremony before the Holy War, but to him, this purpose was actually dispensable. He stared at the Cruz Knight and could not help but curse in his heart. However, he still suppressed his emotions and replied faintly, "We came here to go to the Empire, so naturally we will not stay here, nor will we go back the way we came. Mr. Knight, do you understand?" "Very well, then what do you mean?" The Cruz Knight seemed to have heard the funniest thing in the world. He looked at Brando's group as if he was looking at a group of idiots. He thought that this group of country bumpkins must have come from some remote place and had never seen the world before. Otherwise, how could they be so dumb? "What we mean is that you must follow the etiquette and open the main gate to welcome the delegation into the fortress. This is related to the dignity of the Empire, and also to prove to the world that you Cruz people are at least not ignorant of etiquette." Brando replied concisely. The Duke's daughter opened her mouth in the back. This time, not to mention the Kurlutz Knight, even she felt that her commander had suddenly become so rigid. The Kurlutz people made it clear that they wanted to belittle them and give these country bumpkins a show of strength. These diplomatic etiquette did not need the Count to remind them. Obviously, the Kurlutz people were already well aware of it, but they did it on purpose. However, if Brando did not expose this last bit of embarrassment, then both sides could still save some face. However, after Brando exposed this last bit of embarrassment, if the Cruz people still insisted on doing this, then the delegation would lose all face. Of course, she did not believe that the Count of Tanajul was that simple. She faintly felt that Brando seemed to be deliberately forcing the Count into a dead end. At the same time, the Cruz Knight's face also changed. "What are you talking about?" He could not help but shout in anger, "I said that it is a time of war, and it is impossible to open the Knight's Gate. Don't you understand, sir? This is the border between the Erewhon Kingdom and the Cruz Empire. I have never heard of any war." Brendel ignored the Knight's reprimand and replied nonchalantly, "You're right. You're right. Is that so?" The Knight could not help but sneer. "Then you can go and convince the Marquis that this order is given by him. If you can convince him that there is no threat of war here, then I will personally open the Knight's Gate to welcome you into the city." Brando looked at him and replied, "Well, I will convince your Marquis, but according to etiquette, you are not qualified to welcome us. This honor was originally reserved for your Marquis deputy, but if I go and convince him, then I am afraid that he will have to personally come and welcome us as an apology." The Cruz Knight could not help but stare at him as if he was looking at a madman. "In your dreams," he finally said, Well, if you don't want to go in with me, then you can wait here. Of course, you are welcome to persuade our Marquis at any time. After that, he left Brando's group and returned to the fortress with his men. It seemed that he really did not want to bother with these Erewhon country bumpkins. After the Kurlutzians left, Avram, the Duke's daughter, and the others subconsciously looked at their leader. Avram only thought that the Count wanted to show off his courage so that he could advance in order to retreat, but the young lord obviously did not expect the Kurlutzians to never fall for this. The Duke's daughter was silent, but she obviously had the same thought in her mind. But the problem was that now that the Kurlutz people had left, they couldn't stay here forever, but whether it was going back or going to the Marquis, it would be a humiliating thing. This matter was obviously caused by their leader, so if someone had to come out and clean up the aftermath, it would naturally be the leader who should come out first. But Brando did not seem to care about this matter at all. He looked up at the towering wall, then turned back and said to the Shire behind him, "The Cruz's men are stubborn. 60 years ago, 60 years later, and even today this has never changed. The Shire, go to my carriage and bring me my sword." Avram did not understand the meaning of this sentence, but the Duke's daughter, who was more astute than him, had already reacted. She stared at the leader of the envoy group, dumbfounded. She seemed to have just remembered that the leader of the envoy group was a sword saint. "No," she quickly objected, "Count, you can't be so impulsive." Brando looked at her and asked, "How am I impulsive, Miss Eugenie?" He actually asked me why I was impulsive. The Duke's daughter almost pulled her hair out. She originally thought that Brando was just a little young and impetuous, but now it seemed that he was completely crazy. She could not help but shout, "If you are going to threaten and kidnap the Marquis, it may cause a war." Brando could not help but be stunned. "Who said that I am going to threaten and kidnap a real noble? Miss Eugenie, you can't wantonly slander my reputation." "You don't plan to do that?" The Duke's daughter was stunned. "Of course. You swear." "Miss Duchess, although it's not that I don't like to joke, this joke of yours is a little too much." Brando replied sternly. This time, the Duke's daughter was a little suspicious. She could not help but stare at Brando suspiciously. But Brando really did not plan to kidnap that bullshit Marquis. First of all, he did not know where the Marquis was. He could not go in and out of this fortress 7 times. But at this time, the Shire had already brought his sword. This sword was not the black Haurangaya that he was used to using, but a crystal-like sword that seemed to be carved out of ice. Brando took the sword and weighed it in his hand, then raised his head and stared at the fortress that had a history of nearly 400 years. "You have to understand one thing, Miss Eugenie." Brando replied, "I never do such troublesome things." After saying this, he raised the sword and waved it at the gate of the fortress. A bright silver line seemed to rise from the ground, and in an instant, it slanted and pierced through the clouds. Chapter 908. It was hard to describe with words, but at that moment, the members of the Erewhon envoys under the fortress saw it for themselves. Brando's casual swinging of the sword seemed to be subdivided into several parts, and each of them could be used as a textbook example of swordsmanship. At that moment, swordsmanship was no longer just a skill to kill, but an art that was pleasing to the eyes. Swordsmanship and the law seemed to be the line of truth that came from the Flame King and the Dragon Clan's ancient swordsmanship. The skills of the Flame King and the mysterious power of the ancient holy sword merged into one at that moment. The dazzling light of the sword rose from the ground, and behind that dazzling brilliance, there was an earth-shattering sound. The huge iron gate was split into 4, and the impact caused the whole gate to sink inwards. Then it fell apart and flew towards the barbican behind it. The aftermath of the sword aura blended into the walls on both sides, and a smooth cut grew on the black rock at a speed visible to the naked eye. Then the whole section of the wall began to collapse downwards. As the bricks and debris fell like rain, the law that maintained the strength of the wall also appeared one by one in the air. These silver lines that represented the power of magic also melted as the sword aura advanced, as if they could not resist it at all. In short, the Knight's Gate of the Black Sword Fortress became history after this sword aura. The refugees were tied to the wooden stakes on both sides of the road in the valley by the Imperial soldiers, but suddenly, everyone's eyes were attracted to that direction. They saw the bright light of the sword rising from the valley, saw the dazzling light of the sword slashing diagonally into the towering Knight's Gate, and saw 1/5 of the fortress wall turned into ashes under the sword aura. They saw a man and a sword standing in front of the Empire, as if he did not need anyone's orders. All the Imperial soldiers who witnessed this scene dropped what they were doing. Those refugees who were supposed to be tied to the wooden stakes were also thrown aside. No one had the time to care about them, but these people did not seem to want to take the opportunity to escape. The Ash Sword Saint? The first thing the Kurlutzians thought of was a famous name. The Sword Saint Darius? Erwin's people were the first to recall their widespread legends. Everyone was stunned. Even the well-armored knights on horseback were at a loss. It seemed like the fortress was under attack, but it was beyond their imagination. It was not their fault. The last time the stronghold was attacked was recorded in historical documents. It was so long ago that it was like a fairy tale. Some people would have thought that this legendary event would happen again in their lifetime. The small group of imperial soldiers outside the fortress froze in place as if they had been bewitched, but the nobles around Brando weren't any better. Duke Viro's daughter, Miss Eugenie, had turned into a puppet. All her movements were frozen at the moment before Brando drew his sword. Even her eyeballs seemed to have lost their ability to move. She just stared at Brando, but it was hard to tell whether she was looking at a madman or an idiot. Avram was scared out of his wits. The ball-shaped creature's mouth was wide open. Judging from the look of shock on his face, even if someone threw a pigeon egg into his mouth, he wouldn't notice. BB count. Miss Enid seemed to be so scared that even her voice was trembling. Even Chiara couldn't help but look at Brendel as if he was a monster. Do you know what you've done? Brando withdrew his sword and did not answer their questions. At this time, the door of Dilfri's carriage in the convoy behind opened a crack, and the little Prince Haruz finally couldn't help but poke his head out and asked cautiously, Teacher, Miss Dilfri asked you what happened? Nothing. Brando replied. Nothing. Eugenie finally reacted. She seemed to have been greatly stimulated and almost jumped up without caring about noble etiquette. Do you want to declare war on the Empire? The princess's words seemed to be stuck in her throat as she suddenly remembered something. She looked at Brendel with fear in her eyes. Count Trenheim. Count Trenheim. Count Trent, oh my lord, don't tell me you really... But before she could finish her sentence she was pulled back by Brendel, because a glaring sword light had appeared between the two of them. Brendel raised the frost chant and blocked the sudden long sword, and the sound of metal clashing against metal could be heard as the two swords clashed against each other. With the sword as the center, silver and golden lines extended at the same time. The lines of law were like a curved shield, completely blocking the attack on the other side. The golden raindrops fell on Brando's silver net formed by the lines of law, but did not penetrate it at all. Cruz finally reacted. This sudden attack was completely out of the Duke's daughter's expectations. She was shocked and naturally swallowed the second half of her sentence. Brando, on the other hand, understood the origin of his opponent in this short exchange. Golden Sacred Flame. His opponent was also an elemental rank. But unfortunately he was still far from being able to catch up to him. The exchange of swords happened in an instant. Brando snorted slightly and swung his sword a second time in an instant, hitting the man's sword. The man immediately screamed, "Truths?" He flew back towards the city wall and crashed into the rubble that was filled with smoke and dust. There was another Kurlutz knight who was about to rush over from the direction of the collapsed walls, but when he saw Brendel's sword, his expression changed and he stopped in his tracks. He asked Brendel fearfully, "Who are you and why are you attacking the Empire?" Brendel sheathed his sword and silently returned the frost chant to its slender scabbard. This crystal scabbard was specially made by the wizards of Buga. Originally Brando did not need it, but these craftsmen were all perfectionists. They loved this legendary sword so much that they could not bear to part with it. They could not wait to make a complete set of equipment, from the scabbard to the sword holder. However, it was a pity that even the silver citizens were unable to repair this legendary holy sword. Brando put the scabbard back in the Shire's hand, then picked up Howran Gaia and looked back at the knight. The armor on his body was obviously not cheap. The accessories on the armor were basically made of pure gold or real mithril, not gilded fake. He also wore a knight's badge, but like most people he did not wear a knight's badge. He did not like to wear a helmet, revealing a head of light golden shoulder-length hair. He looked like a middle-aged man in his 50s or 60s. Brando could tell at a glance the identity of this person. The Frontier Legion stationed at the Black Sword Fortress in this era should be the noble army from Rogeria. The commander of this army was Marquis Asova Bridgewell, and the Legion had 3 elemental rank masters: Fire Wolf Ivan, Imperial Sword Rovak, and White Shadow Fana. The person in front of him was Imperial Sword Rovak. Although Brando had not dealt with this person in his previous life, he knew that his elemental element was the rarer water element in Cruz. He was also good at Cruz's knight and noble swordsmanship. He also mastered this Rogeria's secret swordsmanship, which was also an intermediate level swordsmanship. This person was good at swordsmanship, but he was very cautious and meticulous in his actions. In fact, although there were many elemental awakeners in the Empire, they were not cabbages after all. Among them, most of the players and crews in the countries under the Holy Cathedral of Fire were still familiar with their names. After Brando recognized this person, he could not help but look at him curiously. In his previous life, this person was a legendary figure among the Erewhon players. Of course, this legend was not about how strong he was later, but because he was one of the 6 elemental awakeners stationed at the Erewhon border of the Empire. It should be known that in this era of history, the entire Erewhon Kingdom's elemental awakeners were only a few people. There were no more than 10 people in the north and south. And these people, in the eyes of the Year of the Sword, who was just a newbie at that time, were all existences that he had to look up to. But today, one of these legendary existences was casually sent flying by him. If he guessed correctly, the guy who controlled the golden sacred flame element should be the Firewolf AI fan. Then, the Imperial Sword Rovak was also frightened by the power of his sword and did not dare to make a move. Brando looked at Rovak, who had a serious expression, and for a moment, he could not help but have such a strange thought in his mind. After sighing, he shook his head and replied seriously, "Mr. Rovak, you should know who I am. As for why I am doing this, Mr. Rovak, you should understand. But then again, now that things have developed to this point, if I want you to persuade your Lord Marquis, let him bring people to welcome the Kurlitz envoys into the fortress. Do you think you can still do it?" In contrast to Brando's understanding, Rovak was extraordinarily serious. His strength was on par with the Firewolf AI fan. Just now, when Brando counterattacked and sent AI fan flying with his sword, it revealed a certain meaning that made the alarm bells in his heart go off. That seemingly indestructible power of the law was obviously on another level. That was the level of the truth, the side of the truth. Rovak did not know that Brando actually borrowed a part of the power of the Frost Chant Sinna, and that his true strength was actually quite far away from the elemental truth. However, in this Imperial Knight's heart, he had already regarded Brando as his #1 enemy. He was stationed at the border between the Empire and Erewhon, so he was not as well informed about this ancient kingdom as the nobles of the Empire. Therefore he did not know where the young man in front of him came from. He was inexplicably surprised. When did such a genius appear among the people of Erewhon? It was as if he appeared out of thin air. After listening to Brando's words, he was extremely regretful. Today he and AI Fan were on duty on the city wall, so naturally he was aware of what happened below. However, he did not think that the people of Erewhon's disrespect was a big deal. Before this, no one had raised any objections about it, whether it was the people of Cruz or the people of Erewhon. Everything was taken for granted. However, he never dreamed that things would develop to this point. This guy actually split the Knight's Gate in half with his sword. Rovak somewhat understood Brando's thoughts. If he was a sacred swordsman of the elemental truth level, he would also be furious when a mere knight captain made things difficult for him. However, he could not help but feel like crying. Who would have thought that a sacred swordsman would suddenly appear among the people of Erewhon? Furthermore, there was not even the slightest bit of news about this in the past few years. It was as if a freak had suddenly appeared in this year. Of course, Rovak did not expect that his thoughts were almost the truth. This world was just so crazy. He only moved his Adam's apple and replied with some difficulty, "I'm afraid that's not possible." "That's why," Brando replied, "our conversation is meaningless, Mr. Rovak. Since you can't do it, let me do it myself." After saying that, he raised Haurangaya and took a step forward. "Your Excellency, you can't do that." The Duke's daughter seemed to have just reacted. She was a little numb as she watched Brando severely injure an Imperial swordsman in front of her. He also scared the other Imperial swordsman to the point of stopping. Of course, she knew these two people, but she was more willing to admit her mistake because everything in front of her was just too crazy. Even her voice was a little weak as she said, "We can't anger the people of Cruz anymore. Your Excellency, are you going to declare war on the Empire?" Rovak was about to cry. He could not help but wonder if this person in front of him was a lunatic. Even if he was a sacred swordsman, how could he do such a crazy thing? For a moment, he vaguely felt that he saw the shadow of another person in Brando. In the hearts of the people of Cruz, that person was also a complete madman. A complete madman. That person's name was Mephisto. Declaration of war? Brando was a little amused. He glanced at Rovak, then at Eugenie and replied, "Miss Eugenie, we are also believers of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. We are responding to the call of the Holy Cathedral to participate in a holy war. But here, we are being unreasonably humiliated by a group of ignorant people. Therefore, It is hard for me not to suspect that these people are trying to deny the legitimacy and God of this war. Saint, now I intend to correct their point of view. Not only is it not to declare war on the empire, but it is to eliminate some stubborn people for the Holy Cathedral. Therefore, contrary to what you think, I am doing this to show the firm and loyal position of the people of Erewhon. Not only will they not be condemned, I think they should be rewarded for this. Eugenie looked at him, dumbfounded. This was clearly the logic of a bandit. But she opened her mouth and suddenly understood what Brando meant. If they inexplicably attacked one of the Empire's fortresses, it would naturally be taken as a declaration of war. But according to what he said, it would be a different situation. The key point was, at this juncture of the Holy War, would the Holy Cathedral of Fire push Erewhon out? Would the Silver Queen suddenly let her south become the most unstable factor in the war? The answer was obvious. She suddenly remembered what Brando had said to them before. A big country had its strength, a small country had its wisdom, and Erewhon also had its own advantages. Indeed, compared to the gains and losses of the entire Holy War, why would the Holy Cathedral of Fire and His Majesty the Emperor be entangled in these details of dignity and face? Chiara obviously understood this at this moment. Understanding Brando's meaning, the little girl snorted softly, "You're thinking too much. Be careful not to get burned by playing with fire." Brando shook his head gently. He was indeed playing with fire, but it was just that he had to play with it. He looked up and waited for Rovak's reply. Rovak's face had already become extremely ugly. He was not stupid and naturally understood the meaning of Brando's words. But he took a light breath and the pride of being an imperial citizen finally prevailed. "You are very strong, Count Rovak, but do you intend to challenge an imperial army alone? I can tell you categorically, Monsieur le Count, that is impossible, and no matter what His Majesty the Emperor's final answer, I am here to tell you, with the glory of the Cruz army, that we will never let you take half a step into this fortress." "If you insist on going to war with us," Rovak shouted, "Cruz Knight, prepare for battle." Brando only heard a soft whoosh and subconsciously looked up. He saw that the griffin cages on the city walls had been opened one after another. Dozens of griffins flew out of the city walls in an instant. These birds of prey in the air screeched and spread their wings. For a moment there was an illusion that they covered the sky. The Imperial Army? Someone in the valley shouted in a shrill voice. The scene in front of him was exactly the same as what he had seen in the Holy War 10 years later. The prosperity of the empire was built on the pride of its citizens. This glorious and glorious army was enough to shock anyone who saw it for the first time. But unfortunately, Brando looked at the white birds of prey that flew out of the city walls. He placed one hand on the scabbard of Haurangaya and the other hand gently pulled out the dark blade of the sacred sword. He had already seen this scene before. He casually threw the scabbard behind him and raised Haurangaya in front of him. "There is something I have to tell you. My army has never been alone." As if to prove this sentence, countless black dots rose from the mountains. "PS, strange, I remember I sent it at 11 o'clock. Thank you for reminding me, I was almost late." Chapter 909. What rose from the mountains were magical creatures that were sculpted from rocks into flying monsters full of power. They had the head of a goat and the body of a human. They had steel-like claws on their limbs and a wingspan of more than 7 meters. Their stony skin shone with a pale green luster under the cold winter sun. They were covered with faintly glowing magic runes, and 2 ghostly green gems formed the eyes of these magical creatures. They were not the most primitive gargoyles but a type of rune golem, rune gargoyles. Brando wanted gargoyles and Tanya, the competent ant, got him the best one. As he said, these things were nothing to the Bugas, so the craftsman mages were happy to help Brando as much as possible without crossing their bottom line, so that he could take back the azure lance for them. The griffins that soared in the sky of the Empire never thought that they would one day face such a battle. The densely packed gargoyles were rising from the mountains into the sky, and in the blink of an eye, they occupied the sky above the mountains. The screams of these magical creatures came one after another, coming from all directions as if they were surrounded. However, the griffins let out a clear and melodious cry at the same time, as if a kind of pride was urging the brave and fearless birds to spread their snow-white wings and meet their enemy. That was the symbol of the Imperium. They took the initiative to attack the enemy that was dozens of times larger than them. They were like straight silver lines that pierced into the dark clouds, but in the next moment, their wings were scattered and their spears were broken. The Imperial soldiers looked at the scene in a daze, watching the ferocious birds of prey of the Empire that they were so proud of vanish in an instant. After a while, a dry warning came from the observation room. It looks like gargoyles. Although there were still 100 Griffin Knight on standby in the fortress, everyone's feet were rooted to the ground at this moment. No one ran down the wall to inform the others because it was too late. The gargoyles were like a dark cloud in the sky. After swallowing the griffins, they spread across half the sky like a flock of migrating birds. When they came over the fortress, the Imperial soldiers still looked up in a daze. It was not until the first rock fell from the sky and smashed the battlements into pieces that they screamed and reacted. A disaster was imminent. Under the preset command, the gargoyles split into 3 as soon as they entered the sky above the fortress, and 3 huge arrowheads in the air pointed in different directions. The first arrowhead made up of 200 gargoyles pointed directly in the direction of the wall, while the second arrowhead made up of 300 gargoyles pointed to the inner city. The remaining gargoyles made up of the largest arrowhead went straight to the headquarters of the Griffin Knight in the Black Sword Fortress, as if they already knew where it was. When the Kurlutzian knights on the city wall saw the 2 huge arrows in the sky flying over the city wall without stopping, they understood what was going on. Their faces were ashen, and only then did they realize that this was definitely a premeditated war. The inner city was in a state of chaos. The soldiers who were not on duty in the fortress area were being rushed out of their residences in the inner city, from various places of entertainment such as bars, brothels, and even lovers' houses. Some were even rushing out from the streets in 2s and 3s. They hurriedly put on their battle robes, put on their helmets, and picked up their weapons. They were either organized or scattered as they rushed towards the direction of the fortress to report. If it was during the Age of Glory, the Age of Chaos, or the half a century before and after the War of Walnut, such a scene would never occur. During that era, even when the Black Sword Fortress was at its most lax, more than 2/3 of the soldiers were on standby at all times. But now this fortress had not experienced any war for nearly 100 years. Even the bandits of Erewhon did not dare to commit crimes in the area ruled by the Empire. After a long period of slacking, they had long developed a habit of being arrogant and condescending. The Empire soldiers were gathering from all directions. Although they were not worth mentioning compared to their predecessors, the last trace of honor and discipline of the Empire soldiers prevented them from completely messing up. Overall, their reaction was much better than the noble soldiers of the south of Erewhon. They were even not inferior to the Black Blade Squad and the Coast Guards that Brando had seen in Ampere Seal. These Rogelia soldiers wearing red and white battle robes gathered under the urging of the bugle and were about to enter the fortress area. It was at this time that they collided head-on with the gargoyles that were rushing from the sky. "Look at the sky!" Someone shouted first, and then the bustling red and white crowd on the street slowly stopped and looked up at the sky. The dense black dots that formed a huge arrowhead were dispersing and then swooping down. In an instant, hundreds of gargoyles swooped down. Gargoyles? Martha above, the Bugas have launched a sneak attack on us. The crowd was surprised and stunned at first, then it turned into a commotion and uneasiness. They began to retreat and finally, under such a shrill scream, it turned into a mad dash. Look for cover. These damned, cunning adepts. The people of Cruz screamed in panic as they tried to find a place to provide shelter. At this moment, the quality of the Empire soldiers was fully displayed. They did not panic like headless flies, nor did they flee in panic like the noble soldiers of the south of Erewhon. Once the Cruz Knights found eaves, low walls, stacked boxes, or other temporary shelter along the street that could provide shelter, they immediately pulled out their weapons and waited for the first wave of attack from the unknown air force before launching a counterattack. The Empire had a military tradition of more than 10 centuries. Their enemies came from all over the world, whether it was the Air Force, the Navy, the monsters, the living, or the returnees. For this army that had been through hundreds of battles and had a profound tradition, it was no surprise. Therefore, after a brief commotion, they immediately calmed down and entered a state of readiness under the command of the nearby Knight Captain. At this moment, if Brando were to see the scene in person, he would be amazed. He would be amazed at the strength of the people of Cruz, and also because this was the same as the Empire's army that he had seen before. After all, the Empire was the Empire. The eagles of Cruz did not just soar in the sky with pride and arrogance. However, the tragedy of the Rogelia soldiers came from the same reason. Brando had seen them before, in another era. Therefore, these soldiers soon saw that the gargoyles' dive was just an illusion. They immediately began to slow down when they approached the sky above the inner city, and then they landed on the rows of roofs throughout the inner city. What are they doing? The Knight of Cruz looked at this scene with inexplicable amazement. The Air Force, as the name implied, was their domain in the sky. If these gargoyles wanted to fight them on the ground, it was obviously impossible. Their doubts were finally answered when they saw the first wizard in a robe and holding a staff jump down from the back of a gargoyle. Wizard. In the nearby streets, every knight sergeant with command felt a little sour in his teeth when he saw this scene. He immediately understood what the other party wanted to do. When Mordenkainen jumped down from the back of his gargoyle with his duck familiar in his arms, he was full of pride when he saw the stunned crew's knight. He looked back and saw that almost every roof on the left had 3 to 4 wizards ready. It was as if an army of wizards had arrived in the inner city of the Black Sword Fortress in an instant. He looked back again, and at this time the people of crews below seemed to have just recovered from their state of shock. The knight immediately commanded the soldiers around him to attack the roofs. Although he knew that the other party could not pose any threat to him, he could not help but feel a little nervous. What a bold idea it was to let wizards come to the front line and fight the enemy soldiers face to face. Not to mention that he had never heard of such a battle before, he had never even thought about it. The so-called wizards naturally wanted to stay as far away from danger as possible. But although he was nervous and his palms were sweaty, he still raised his staff and began to chant spells at the army of crews below. The average strength of the soldiers of the Imperial Frontier Legion was at least above the middle level of black iron. The low roofs of the inner city were not too difficult for them. In a short while, some Imperial soldiers climbed up the roofs with the help of the terrain. Mordenkainen saw that the nearest soldier was less than 20 feet away from him. He could even see the ferocious face of the other party and the cold gleam of the long sword in his hand. In his heart, he was more than willing to directly throw the spells he had prepared at that guy. But at the last moment, he forcibly shifted his target and raised his staff to cast a spell at the Imperial soldiers clustered in the street. The law of stillness and stagnation, imprison, Mordenkainen shouted. As if there was an invisible wall descending from the direction he was pointing at, there was a slight vibration in the air. All the Imperial soldiers on the street immediately became motionless as if they were possessed. At the same time, out of the hundreds of magi that descended with the gargoyles, about a third of them completed the same control spell. The other third were too nervous and failed to cast the spell, while the remaining third could not help but cast the spell on the few soldiers closest to them. But even this one-third success rate caused almost half of the streets in the inner city to be completely controlled by the spell in an instant. After casting the spell, Mordenkainen turned his head back, sweating profusely. Only then did he see that the soldier who had climbed up had already been slapped down by the gargoyle. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief, and a faint sense of pride grew in his heart, because he knew that at least he was the first wizard to cast a spell under this kind of tactic. Based on this point alone, he could already shake off the identity of an apprentice and step into the ranks of an official wizard. The inner city was falling into a special kind of dead silence, as if time had been frozen. The Imperial soldiers who had gathered and jammed the streets quickly lost the ability to fight back under the control of the wizards. It was not that they did not think of counterattacking, but the result of such a dense formation exposed to the attack of magic was imaginable. Almost immediately they lost more than 2/3 of their manpower. Next, the sorcerers only needed to subdue the fish that escaped the net one by one. In the meantime, the Kurlutz Zero-Star organization launched a long-range attack together, but it was almost useless under the protection of spells. The commando team formed by the Imperial Knights, under the protection of hundreds of gargoyles, also had no effect. Instead, they fell into the trap and became captives. Of course, the Empire also had wizards, but wizards in 2s and 3s were basically no match for hundreds of wizards gathered together. After sporadic counterattacks, they quickly realized that the situation was hopeless. They either raised their hands and surrendered, or simply found a place to hide and seek self-protection. It seemed that in just a moment the Black Sword Fortress had lost most of its backup. The head of the Griffin Knight Regiment, Mariel, stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in his office, silently watching the gargoyles in the sky leave. On the other side of his line of sight, the headquarters of the Griffin Knight Regiment had long been in a mess. This Griffin Fortress, which was built about 2 centuries ago, was tragically not built according to the standards of this era, nor was it built with magic protection. The flight path of the Griffin cage was directly exposed to the outside according to the Air Force tradition of about 200 years ago. This was because everyone knew that the enemy of the Black Sword Fortress was the Erewhon people, and the weak air force of the Erewhon Knight could not pose any threat to this fortress. However, it was this traditional understanding that brought about a devastating blow to the fortress. Mariel still had not figured out how those damn gargoyles came about. Originally, he was still sending a messenger to inquire about the loud noise on the other side of the wall, and at the same time, he ordered some of the night to prepare to take off. However, he did not expect the attack to come so quickly. Before the first batch of Griffin Knight could release their beloved griffins from the cages, the black cloud in the sky had already flown over the Knight regiment. What happened next was simply a nightmare. Before that, Mariel had never heard of such an attack. The gargoyles began to dive and then threw down flashing crystals. Most of these crystals hit the passage of the Griffin cage, and a small part hit the warehouse of the Knight regiment. What happened next was what he saw now. The passage of the Griffin cage had been completely destroyed, and about 160 griffins and more than 30 knights were trapped inside. It was hard to say how many of them could be saved. As for the warehouse, Mariel looked at the two big holes in the ground with a gloomy face. For a moment he was speechless. At this time, outside the ruins of the Knight's Gate, Rovak, who was pointing his sword at Brando, obviously did not know that such a wonderful thing had happened in the fortress behind him. Even so, his face did not look good. Above him, the Empire's soldiers were fiercely fighting with the gargoyles. The wizards in the fortress had already joined the battle, and the longbowmen and crossbowmen had also begun to get into formation. It could be said that the situation was barely stabilized. Behind him, more than 100 Drake Knights had finished their preparations. These cruise knights were wearing heavy armor and they all raised their spears. The triangular flags on the spears fluttered in the wind, like a fiery red ocean. The Drake Knights were restlessly adjusting their footsteps, facing the uninvited guests outside the gate. It was as if as long as the order was given, all the knights would come out in full force. But at this moment Rovak did not feel safe at all. This was because in his vision Brando was approaching him step by step. This count was alone, and he was holding a sword in one hand. However, he did not seem to be at a disadvantage at all. He was only one person, and he was facing the cruise knights with a calm face. It was as if these glorious knights in history did not exist in his eyes. Rovak had seen such a calm look before. When the bear warriors from the Black Crow Principality charged at that man stood proudly on the battlefield with a sword in his hand. Rovak could still see that man standing proudly on the battlefield. Could it be that in less than 60 years, Erwin had another sword saint like that? Rovak's forehead was covered in cold sweat, and he suddenly thought of another possibility. Behind Brando, Medisha was looking at her lord's back. She silently summoned her unicorn and mounted it. The White City Vanguard, the Nightsong Tiger, Falerne, and the others were behind her in a charging formation ready to attack. But at this moment Brando turned around and said, "Medisha, go and subdue the Empire's squad and save the refugees." "My lord." Brando did not answer her. Instead, he turned to the Shire and said, "The Shire, I'll leave the wall to you." "No problem." Brando then turned around and saw Rovak charging at him. "Dragon Knights, follow me," Rovak shouted. But in the next moment he could no longer make such a bold sound because he saw Brando split into two in front of him. He was dumbfounded as he watched the two Brandos casually walk past him. The two Brandos raised their swords at the same time. There were no fancy moves. They just raised their swords and walked forward slowly. Even a beginner swordsman would be able to dodge it easily. Rovak also lowered his head to avoid the attack, and at the same time tried to distinguish the real Brendel from the two of them. But just as he lowered his head, a scene that made his soul fly out of his body happened. He clearly saw that he had dodged the opponent's sword, but when he lowered his head, he saw that the shining blade was still in front of his chest. This is impossible. Just as this thought appeared in Rovak's mind, he felt a slight pain in his chest. There was a long gash in his armor, and he felt his vision go dark. His knees went soft and he knelt on the ground. Chapter 9-10. Brando slowly sheathed his sword. It didn't feel like he was fighting on the battlefield, but more like a swordsman who had returned home and carefully sealed his beloved sword. He walked past Rovak slowly, and with every step he took, there was a shadow overlapping with him. Every shadow seemed to be using a different sword technique. Erwin's military sword technique had the cruelty and ruthlessness of Madara's sword technique. Sometimes it was like Fanzin's sword technique, the sword of the White Knight of Grecius's knight, and sometimes it was the sword technique of the Cruz's people, the simple and pure sword technique of the knight. But Rovak couldn't see any of them clearly. What hit him was the simplest sword strike, the one that he thought he had dodged. However, the sword landed heavily on his breastplate, causing blood to gush out. His water element did not even have the time to play any role before it was shattered. At the last moment, he saw countless silver lines of the law of nature as his opponent slowly retracted his sword, bringing along countless fragments of his armor. Like countless sparkling spots of light, they returned to dust bit by bit. Rovak opened his mouth as if he wanted to shout this sentence from his chest: "The highest level of element? The sword of space." But in the end he didn't make any sound. He knelt on the ground and then fell heavily. Brando gently wiped the blood on his sword, and it turned into countless rose-red beads that flew into the air like a crescent moon. The dust above the rubble was dissipating. He seemed to be walking on clouds, and the hem of his count's coat fluttered in the cold wind between the mountains. He looked up, and the distance between him and the Imperial Drake Knight Regiment was just the distance of the city gate. The Imperial Knights were regrouping and the horn was blown. They seemed to be shouting a strange command. The Drake Knight in the front row began to move forward slowly. The ground trembled slightly, and their spears were like trees in a forest. The flags floated like the fiery Red Sea, and their shining silver armor moved up and down. Brando heard their command, and then the spears were lined up in rows, forming a bunch of intersecting lines that pointed at him. The knights began to gallop. The undulating spears were like a black wave. But at that moment Brando thought of Scarlet. He silently looked at the knight, and a voice in his heart answered, "Did you hear that, Scarlet? No matter what Her Majesty told you, this will be the answer of the Lord of Abes." Brendel gradually quickened his pace, and the knights also began to charge forward. Both sides crossed each other in an instant, but it was as if there was an invisible force that automatically separated the Imperial Knights. Brendel passed through them, and with every step he took, he left behind an afterimage. Each afterimage raised a sword to block a knight's spear, and then threw the knight and the earth dragon into the air. He took 10 steps forward and the knight's attack. The knight fell to the ground and it was a mess. So this is the Sword Saint. The Duke's daughter looked at all of this with her mouth agape. She only felt that the usual worldview in her mind had been completely overturned at this moment. Her mind was full of chatter and buzzing, but she could not say a word when it reached her mouth. The development of the situation seemed to be completely out of her expectations from the beginning. She did not know what Brando wanted to do. It did not seem like he was just acting out of anger or that he was young and impetuous. Everything he did was obviously premeditated, but she could not guess why he did it. Was it because of a subordinate who was kidnapped by the Empire? No, she did not consider this possibility at all unless he was really crazy. But unfortunately, she thought that the most inconceivable idea might be the closest to the truth. Beside him, the ball-shaped man was already scared out of his wits, and he directly collapsed to the ground. The little princess of the Grand Duke of Grenoires held her wet nurse's hand tightly, and asked in fear, "Mother Elsa, is the Count starting a war?" The young wet nurse's face was pale and she trembled, unable to say a word. In her opinion, this was clearly a war. Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles once fought against 1,000 people in Oler, and with his sword, he made the Empire's people completely terrified. Even His Majesty the Emperor had to send out 2 knight regiments and 3 sword saints to encircle and annihilate him, but even so, he still left safely. But now, what Brando was doing was the same thing. The attack power of an elemental activation powerhouse on the battlefield was unparalleled. Although he still could not fight against a real army by himself, a mere 100 Earth Dragon Knights were not too big of a problem for him. After the first wave of attack was thwarted, the Imperial Knights immediately began to adjust their tactics, trying to surround him and suppress him as much as possible with the advantage of numbers. Generally speaking, this was the most effective way to fight against an elemental-level powerhouse. But that was only generally speaking. Brando took the last step forward. This step seemed to have crossed a distance of 100 meters in the ordinary sense. It was as if his back foot had just left the ground, and his front foot had already reached the farthest corner of the Knight Regiment's encirclement. The Earth Dragon Knight did not even have time to react. He saw the space in front of him flash slightly, and a dazzling silver splendor had spilled out from it. Then he flew out from the Earth Dragon's back together with his saddle. Brando's sword struck out, and before the afterimage disappeared, he had already appeared in another direction. Then there was another silver splendor, and a knight flew out diagonally. It seemed that in an instant, a dozen Brandos appeared in the gradually shrinking encirclement of the knight. The afterimages appeared one after another, and then disappeared one after another. In the end there was only one left. Brando stood alone in the middle of the encirclement of the Imperial Knights. With him as the center, there was not a single knight on any of the Earth Dragons. Further away, the Imperial Knights on the periphery were already stunned. It was not that they had never seen a Sword Saint before. There were many Sword Saints in the Empire. There were 2 Sword Saints in the 4 legions and 7 in the Holy Cathedral. This did not include the Sword Saints who were scattered in rumors. A century ago, the Empire had 2 Sword Saints who had now become legends. However, among the Sword Saints they knew, none of them had such strange swordsmanship. Brando flicked the dust on his black woolen sleeves, and looked up at the knight who surrounded him. He thought that his performance was not bad, but it was far from enough. He had to become famous in one battle so that no one would dare to ignore his existence. He had to let the people of Cruz understand that he was the grandson of Darius, the successor of the Marshal of the Allied forces, and Erewhon's people were indispensable forces in the Holy War. He believed that the Silver Queen would take this into consideration. He raised his left hand, and the blessing of Bahamut shone silver under the sunlight. However, countless silver threads of the law had already risen from Brando's side. They intertwined like a silver net and instantly spread across the entire barbican. Wherever it passed, it was as if an invisible shockwave swept across the entire knight regiment. Brando gently clenched his hand, and the entire regiment of ground dragon knights, including hundreds of silver knights, immediately rose from the ground. As if they were affected by an anti-gravity spell, they screamed in horror and struggled, but it was useless. Brando gently pushed them, and all the knights and ground dragons were separated. It was as if a magical hand had disrupted the order and then rearranged it. The entire square was instantly empty, and the knights and ground dragons were fixed in the air in all directions. There was only one person left in front of Brando. It was a woman with a face full of wrinkles, wearing the Empire's red battle robe, holding a long sword and a layer of fiery red threads of the law floating around her. She quietly looked at him. "Madame Savannah." Brando politely greeted her as if he had expected her to be here. "I know you." The swordswoman replied with a voice full of vicissitudes. "You are the grandson of Sword Saint Darius. If you want to protect your grandfather, why do you have to do this? If you insist on doing things your own way, you will drag many innocent people into the flames of war. Do you understand? The Empire will not tolerate such provocation." Brando looked at the elderly woman. During the Holy War, she had once served as his grandfather's adjutant. Among the 3 sword saints of the Black Sword Fortress, she was the oldest and the most powerful. Her name was White Shadow, but she was the strongest of the Golden Flame Sword Saints. But he still shook his head. "The grudge between my grandfather and the Empire can be resolved if necessary," he replied slowly, "but today's lesson is only to teach the arrogant people of the Empire a lesson. The teachings of the Holy Cathedral of Fire have never written that anyone is superior to anyone else. There may have been such an empire in history. But I want to ask you a question, Madame Savannah. Where are the people of Myrna today? Why did Guilt the Great and the 3 sages fight?" Savannah looked at him as if she was not moved by his words at all. She only shook her head. "For this reason you want to start a war so that people can face the people of Erewhon? Count Guilt, this kind of honor is meaningless to the soldiers who died in battle. I think you should understand this point. The ancient saying of the 9 phoenixes, for the sake of the superiors, one must not be angry and fight." "There is no war here, Madame Savannah," Brando replied. "Are you deceiving yourself? There is only one dispute here, Madame Savannah. Since you people of Cruz think that Erewhon is not qualified to be respected by you, then I will use my strength to correct your point of view. There was someone in history who treated my grandfather the same way. Guess who that person was?" Brando replied. Savannah's face changed slightly. "The Black Raven Duchy, you mean?" Brando interrupted her. "I'm glad that you remember this, Madame Savannah. I will answer your question again. I am the leader of Erewhon's diplomatic corps. I fight for my kingdom and the glory of my guards. This rule is written in the ancient books of the Holy Cathedral. It is sacred and cannot be violated. Since you people of Cruz have challenged the glory of my guards, just like how the guards of the Black Raven Duchy challenged my grandfather, then you should be prepared, right? Wait, this is the logic of a bandit. We are." Savannah's face darkened. She hurriedly tried to explain, but she was interrupted by Brando for the second time. "No one said that the people of Cruz can be detached from worldly affairs, right? This seems like it." But Savannah's eyes flashed with anger. She couldn't help but say word by word, "Do you think that you can defeat the Border Legion of Rogeria with your little guards? I'm telling you it's impossible, Mr. Earl. If you let the people of Cruz and Erewhon kill each other because of your selfishness, the Empire will not tolerate your sophistry, and your kingdom will not accept such an excuse." "Yes," Brendel replied, "at least compared to what you did in the Alcash Mountains, I'm not so cold-blooded that I can look at life and death. That's why I only want some people to lower their heads and not take their lives." Naive, wishful thinking. Savannah raised her sword and said, "The people of the Empire would rather die than lower their heads. Raise your head and look at the sky, Count. Your ability is not so great that you can force us to submit. Have you seen the scene of two ferocious beasts of equal strength fighting each other? Grandson of Darius, if I were you, I would order your men to stop attacking immediately before the consequences are out of control. Brando shook his head and said, That's exactly what I wanted to say to you. Throw down your sword and surrender, Miss Savannah. You are not a prisoner of the enemy. You are just apologizing to your allies. Besides, your resistance is meaningless. If I were you, I would look up and see what is happening in the sky. Savannah was slightly startled. She raised her head in confusion. But not far from her, Avram and the Duke's daughter were already looking at the sky. The Empire's wizards were like specks of dust floating above the walls of the Black Sword Fortress. In the sky above the fortress, the Black Rune Gargoyles' attacks and the Empire's counterattacks were fiercely intertwined. They were gradually turning the situation around. The remaining 200 gargoyles were unable to get close to the walls under the intense firepower, and gradually they began to suffer casualties. The Empire's soldiers almost couldn't help but cheer. Although they didn't know how the battle inside the fortress was going, at least on the walls they were about to win. As long as the enemy couldn't climb the walls, it was only a matter of time before the scales of victory tilted. But all of this only lasted until the appearance of the young wizard. Avram looked at the sudden battle with fear. Beside him, Eek and the officer from Yanalasu had already mounted their horses and were preparing to follow Medisha to save the refugees. As for Avram, his mind was filled with thoughts of how to end the battle. No, it should be said that there was no way to end the battle. This damned Earl had actually launched a surprise attack on the Empire's fortress. This was something that couldn't be justified. He could almost imagine how furious the Emperor would be after hearing this news. What's more, he subconsciously thought that this sneak attack was most likely going to be a loss. He saw that with the help of the Empire's wizards, the Empire's guards were gaining the upper hand, while the Earl was still fighting with the Earth Dragon Knight. He actually sent a young wizard to deal with the battle on the walls. But what could a young wizard do? The knowledge and wisdom of a wizard were accumulated over the course of time. In Avram's imagination, those real wizards should be like those old pedants he saw in Karsuk. However, the name Charles did sound a little familiar. He couldn't help but glance at that person from the corner of his eyes. But after that glance he couldn't look away anymore. The Shire slowly rose into the sky, his wizard robe fluttering in the cold wind. With his arrival, all the wizards on the battlefield subconsciously felt a sense of fear rising from the bottom of their hearts. An era ago, the flame of magic was ignited for the first time. A wise being taught this law that had never existed before to all the people of Silver and Black Iron. It was as if before that, no one understood the origin of law magic and elemental magic. It was different from divine spells and runic spells of the witches. But from that moment on, it was born in this world and shaped a great civilization. Where did magic come from? Perhaps only one person could answer this question. That person was Tumen. However, at this moment all of the sorcerers felt a power that came from the same source. It was as if an ancient voice was calling out to its people, and the trembling that came from the depths of their souls was enough to shock everyone. The Shire was responding to the unknown being. Silver Staff Wizard, requesting permission as a planeswalker. Permission granted. The young wizard gently flicked his robe, his eyes flashing with silver flames. His gaze swept across the battlefield, and he couldn't help but reply with a strange tone. So, this is the power of a planeswalker. So, this is the source of the law. He raised a finger. In the name of the scroll of wisdom, the law, the flowing wind, and the shallow sea, I present the third law, the dragon of ether. At every moment, the energy is always changing forms. It sweeps and rushes, flowing endlessly. Thousands of years ago, the people of Fanner who worshipped the sun in the south of the Minor Plains had seen the miraculous scene of dragons migrating. They were as blue as the sea, sweeping across the sky. Thousands of years later, the people of Cruz witnessed this magnificent scene once again. P.S. You guys were complaining that my writing was all kinds of weak and not impressive. Now it's time to put in some effort. Alright, at the end of this chapter I'm asking for more votes next month. Do you want to read more? There's more. Also, ignorance. Don't think of waiting for my forces. I'm not that good at PvP. This reminder is for your own good, got it? Chapter 9:11. A dreamy blue color filled the sky. Behind Charles, flashing summoning circles were emerging one after another. What swam out of them were dreamlike creatures that should only exist in legends. It was a life made up of pure energy. It was between substance and non-substance. It existed in the physical world, yet it did not exist in the physical world. Every moment, every minute, every second they were constantly changing their attributes and forms. They were visitors from beyond their borders, the ether dragons. They had the shape of a dragon, but they also had a pair of wings like a manta ray. They were transparent, like soft glass or jellyfish that floated in the air. However, their form was not stable. They were constantly changing, like a rainbow with a blue background. One by one, the crew's wizards stopped their spells. They realized that their spells had no effect on these strange creatures. These creatures themselves were a part of energy. They did not seem to exist in the physical world. Sharp lines of law and violent elemental magic tore through these dreamlike creatures, but they could not hurt them at all. It was as if they had hid an illusion, passing through their transparent bodies. Everyone realized this fact one by one. Their attacks were unable to harm these dragons at all. The entire battlefield gradually fell into a strange state of silence. The wizards and the soldiers of the Empire all stopped their attacks in bewilderment. Some of them looked at all this in silence, admiring the magnificent scenery. But finally someone realized what this was. These are ether dragons? I didn't expect them to exist. The records of the Fanner people were not absurd legends. The wizards whispered to each other, passing on the secret knowledge that only they knew. On the other hand, the Imperial commander on the Black Sword Fortress was infuriated. He had no interest in the so-called knowledge and legends, but the wizards had left their posts without permission, which greatly reduced the intensity of the firepower on the battlefield. It was not easy to gain the upper hand, but now the gargoyles had taken it back. He went to the leader of the wizards and pointed at the strange creatures. I don't care what they are, but your mission now is to chase them all out. I don't want to see any of these messy things on my wall. He shouted. He threw a tantrum, but found that the wizards were looking at him strangely. What? Did I say something wrong? Those are spirits from the ether, Sir Commander. They are the symbol of pure energy. Our spells can't hurt them at all. Have you ever seen a drop of water drowning in the ocean? Besides, to us they are the real ocean, the wizard leader replied politely. The Knight Commander scratched his head. I don't care who is the water droplet and who is the ocean, but you have to tell me how to deal with these things, right? I don't want my soldiers to die without knowing why. Commander, you don't have to worry at all. If the Fanner people are not lying, the ether dragon's biggest characteristic is that they exist in two worlds at the same time. Their constantly changing energy forms maintain the connection between the ether and the physical world. If you can't fight them in two worlds at the same time, then your attacks won't hurt them at all. The wizard leader looked at the beautiful creatures outside the city wall with a look of admiration, but the Knight Commander was obviously dissatisfied with the way he looked at them. At least he didn't think that it was the look of an enemy. Of course, he didn't understand that the ether dragons were the symbol of magic. Their blue color was the color of the Buga's flag. Although the Bugas were known as the Silver Alliance, their emblem was an eye on the blue ocean. It symbolized the two extremes of the wizard world, knowledge and magic. Doesn't that mean that I can't do anything to them? Why don't we just surrender? The Knight Commander replied impatiently. Why do you say that, Sir Commander? The wizard leader pretended to be surprised and looked at the Knight Commander, but in his heart, he was full of contempt for this poor man who knew nothing about the nature of the world. They can attack me, but we can't attack them. Can we still fight this war? Sir Commander, I don't think you need to worry about this at all. The wizard leader smiled. The ether dragon is a fragile and beautiful creature. It's not as powerful as you think. Although they look huge, it's only because their energy will naturally disperse in our world. And these creatures are actually very weak. Although they represent energy itself, they can't master the laws. It's like saying that humans represent a kind of life, but they can't control the laws of life. You and your soldiers can't attack them because they can't attack you. The commander didn't understand it all, but at least he understood the last sentence. He couldn't help but frown and ask, You're saying that these things have no attacking ability at all. Then why did our opponent summon them? Are they trying to trick us? I'm afraid that's not the case. What I mean is, it's not that they can't attack you, but the realm of ether and the physical world are parallel worlds. The two worlds don't affect each other. If they want to affect our world, they have to switch to our world. Wait, I get it. The commander interrupted this self-righteous guy and said loudly, You mean when they switch to our world I can attack them, right? The wizard leader looked at this guy with some surprise. The Knight Commander couldn't help but snort coldly in his heart. He thought to himself, these self-righteous guys. If he could, he wouldn't bother to deal with these weird guys. But he still had one last question. Before he left, he asked, Sir Wizard, since these things are so fragile, then the person who summoned them can't be that powerful. I think you should be able to deal with him. Don't let him do anything else. But this time he didn't get the answer he wanted. All the magi present looked at Charles in the sky with fear lingering in their hearts. Sir Commander, you're wrong. The ether dragon itself represents something beyond your imagination. The ether dragon can't master the laws, but he can. We still don't know who this master is, but we can be sure that he has mastered a deeper level of the laws. All of us here can testify to this. Just a moment ago, we all felt the vibration from the sea of magic. The wizard leader shook his head with a solemn expression. You may not understand what I'm telling you, Sir Commander, but I have a suggestion for you. You'd better use your soldiers to create some trouble for him. Otherwise we may not be his match. What? The commander was shocked. But he looks much younger than you. In the world of wizards, knowledge and power are the strongest, not age, the wizard leader replied. Are you sure? I'm not sure. The wizard leader shook his head. It's just a guess. But you can bet that I'm wrong, Sir Commander. The commander glanced at these wizards in long robes and hoped that he was wrong. But he didn't know that everyone present had the same idea. Savannah raised her head and saw this scene. She saw the Empire's soldiers launch a desperate counterattack. The azure sea looked so dazzling, but it was incredibly fragile. The ether dragon's attack was far less dazzling than their appearance. She could clearly analyze that the strength of these strange creatures was no higher than the peak of the silver level. They were on par with most of the Empire's knight on the city wall. And what was gratifying was that after the ether dragons launched their attack, they quickly suffered casualties. The attacks that could not hurt them before, when they switched to the material world, shot them down from the sky for the first time. But the ether creatures that fell from the sky often ended their lives in a strange way. It was like a dazzling self-explosion. Their transparent bodies crashed into the city wall and then exploded into a light blue ripple. Under the shock of the ripple, the Empire's soldiers were unharmed, and the city wall was not damaged at all. The only change was that the spells of the Empire's wizards began to become sparse. The lady vaguely understood what was going on, but what she found strange was that the number of ether dragons was decreasing very fast, far faster than the speed of their deaths. They seemed to have occupied the whole sky before, but in an instant there were only a few left. Where did the ether dragons go? She vaguely felt that something was wrong, but she didn't know what the problem was. But what really puzzled Miss Venna was that this was what Brando wanted her to see, so that she could admire how he failed. But she obviously did not see such frustration on the face of this descendant of Darius. Brando was still smiling as he looked at the sky. That confident look had never faded. The ether dragons in the sky finally disappeared one by one. But this was not good news for the Empire's wizards. They were speechless. They had never seen these legendary creatures and did not expect them to burn their magic after death. This only led to one result, and that was that all the wizards who were caught off guard had their magic depleted in the first moment. A few of the more senior wizards were still fine, but the apprentices around them were all pale and swaying. The ether dragons were upgraded from the young wind spirit dragons and spiders, and this characteristic was also in the same vein. But immediately someone discovered a new problem. They're disappearing at the wrong speed. No, they're not disappearing. They're moving to the ether realm, Captain. The wizards were much more knowledgeable than a mere swordsman like Venna, and immediately realized the problem. But at this moment, the Shire was turning the face of the card. The Planeswalker's law was like a flame, burning fiercely in his body. This flame seemed to ignite his eyes, making them shine with the same silver light. He looked down at the crew's stronghold from above, and there seemed to be two different consciousnesses in his mind. One was thinking about the battle situation, and the other was counting carefully. After the Empire's wizards were defeated, the gargoyles began to regain the upper hand. Although they still had to face the difficult Empire's longbowmen, at least they did not have to face the risk of being torn apart by terrible spells at any time and place. Moreover, the magic defense of the Black Sword Rampart was gradually weakening, and the wizards who injected magic into it were now depleted of their magic. And in the Shire's body, the magic that had been completely exhausted in order to summon the ether dragons was slowly recovering, and the speed of recovery seemed to be gradually increasing as the ether dragons disappeared. And this rising magic was once again injected into the face of the ether dragons. Then a new batch of ether dragons appeared in the sky. The crew's people were looking up at the sky, and a considerable number of them even opened their mouths wide. Look over there, there's more over there. There's more here too. Kill them. They're disappearing again. New monsters have appeared again. It was chaos on the city wall. The Empire's soldiers and wizards were dumbfounded as they watched the ether dragons appear and disappear and reappear. But every time they disappeared, they would bring new companions with them, as if they were increasing geometrically. No one understood what was going on, but the ether dragons seemed to have really converged into an ocean, and when they launched their last attack, the terrifying tsunami-like scene finally arrived. In the face of thousands of uncountable enemies, even the proudest Kurlutzians could not help but throw away the weapons in their hands weakly. That was a battle that no longer had any meaning. The Shire seemed to be controlling this sea of magic that was full of power, and the ocean blue magic energy gathered under his feet. It was not that the Empire's commanders did not think of attacking him, but it was meaningless. Every time they were about to achieve their goal, a pure silver holy shield would appear in front of the Shire. That was the holy song of protection. Hippamera held the will of the mountains in her hand, and had the support of endless magic from the ether dragons. She had chosen the target of this spell countless times. The last scene that Savannah saw was that the blue ocean had completely covered the city wall of the Black Sword Fortress. It was not that she had never seen such a spectacular scene, but that was during the Holy War, when she was facing the most powerful wizards of Saint Tassel. She seemed to have finally recognized the young wizard. "It's him." The lady muttered to herself in disbelief. "He's not dead. The genius of the Black Tower wizards, I should have known. He has always been so unexpected." Brando was slightly startled. It seemed that this was the second time he had heard such words. He could not help but raise his head and look at the Shire in the sky. Savannah had already retracted her gaze. Cruz's men had been completely defeated, and the reinforcements in the fortress had yet to arrive. She could already imagine what had happened. "You won," she replied calmly. "I just didn't expect that after 40 years he would actually become a great wizard. The Black Tower wizards finally have a wizard leader after 1,000 years. Those who made the decision back then must have never thought that this day would come. But grandson of Darius, what have you gained? Other than the hatred of the Empire, you have gained nothing." Brando knew that this lady who was known as the White Swordsman must have misunderstood something. She actually thought that the Shire had crossed the extreme plane and become a great wizard. However, he did not expose this misunderstanding. In fact, this misunderstanding was exactly what he needed at the moment. As for what he had gained, he looked at the blue reflection in the sky and gently shook his head. The people of the Empire would never understand what he had gained. Count Tonagel had gone mad. Whether it was in Yenbao or Grey Harbor, whether it was from the north of the kingdom to the south of Ampere Seal, or from Randner to the dense forests of Grimoires, as long as there were people living there, whether it was the nobles, the commoners, or even those with unknown identities and ulterior motives, all of them were discussing the news that came back from Balta after the weather in the north had turned cold and there were a couple of snowflakes. The royal faction had also gone mad. Other than Makarov, Oberway and the Wolf Baron, everyone else was like a shark that smelled blood. They were already dissatisfied with the count who ordered them around, and now they were venting their dissatisfaction through various channels. Secret letters were passed to Makarov and the other leaders of the royal faction, and every word written on them was enough to make even the boldest of radicals tremble in fear. It was full of words of advice, abuse, criticism, questioning and even slander. Makarov could only smile bitterly at Oberway. These things were too obvious and he could not help but doubt the intelligence of his colleagues. But what made him doubt his own intelligence was the other letters piled up on his desk. These letters were not slander but letters from the north that conveyed some kind of message. The words written in bright red on the letters were enough to make anyone who read them think that they were reading a ridiculous story. On the 25th of the month of Frost, Count Tonagel conquered the Black Sword Fortress. In this battle, other than the Count himself losing his gargoyles, there were few casualties. After that, Count Tonagel forced, or rather escorted, the entire imperial army to hold a grand welcoming ceremony for Erwin's diplomatic group. After that, he released all the captives and compensated the Knight's Gate out of courtesy. On the 27th of the month of Frost, Count Tonagel and his diplomatic group passed through the Tory Canyon and defeated several Cruz nobles who came to challenge them. On the 30th of the month of Frost, Count Tonagel and his diplomatic group conquered the Tory territory and extorted a large sum of ransom called compensation for the damage to their reputation and compensation for mental anguish, before releasing all the nobles. On the 7th of the month of Winter Harp, Count Tonagel defeated the Cruz's Solstice Knights Legion. On the 15th of the month of Winter Harp, Count Tonagel and his diplomatic group defeated Anzaruta's army. On the 19th of the month of Winter Harp, Count Tonagel, Makarov and Oberway silently read the last sentence of the letter and gently placed it in front of Princess Griffin. They couldn't help but ask tiredly, "All right, Your Highness, can you please tell me what Count Tonagel wants to do?" Princess Griffin glanced at the letter with a guilty conscience. Then she forced a smile at her two courtiers. I think, his lordship, he should know what to do. Really? Makarov looked at the princess silently. Chapter 9:12. Bettina, you're back. As soon as the maidservant with a lovely round face entered the room, she was surrounded by several other maidservants who chattered and greeted her. Bettina patted her apron and raised her eyebrows to look at the mistress of the house. She then made a gesture to the other maidservants to keep quiet and asked in a low voice, Shoo, let me ask you, after I left, did the countess have a good rest? Hearing this question, the sisters immediately became gloomy. Since Scarlet had been placed under house arrest by Her Majesty the Queen, she had been very depressed all day, and sometimes she would talk to her spear, which they did not know where it came from. This made them very suspicious, and they wondered if there was something wrong with the countess's head. Every day, they had to report Scarlet's daily routine to Her Majesty the Queen. Her Majesty obviously still cared about Scarlet very much. At least, she never let outsiders handle this matter. Every time, she would personally take time out of her busy schedule to listen to Bettina's report. However, regarding the countess's strange behavior, Her Majesty did not say anything, so naturally, they did not dare to speculate. Scarlet was always depressed. She did not eat much and slept very little. It was a headache for them. Seeing the expression on the maidservants' faces, Bettina understood something. She sighed and said, Sigh, let the countess have a good rest. Don't make a fuss anymore. She must be homesick, but Her Majesty the Queen does not allow her to go back. Yes, yes, the maidservants replied in unison. We children from the mountains are always nostalgic for our homeland. I often remember the maple trees in my hometown. Another maidservant looked at Bettina's face and asked in a low voice, Bettina, you don't look very good. Is Her Majesty the Queen in a bad mood again? Shoo, Bettina glared at the maidservant. Don't talk nonsense, but Her Majesty's mood is quite bad today. What's wrong? This question seemed to have aroused the maidservants' curiosity. They hurriedly lowered their voices and asked, Isn't it because of the countess? Bettina sighed. She did not know how many times she had sighed. It was as if Her Majesty's bad mood had affected her. Is it that count from the countryside again? Lower your voice, idiot, Betessa replied. That countess came from Erewhon. Do you know Erewhon? It's a small kingdom in the south of the empire. That's right, our countess also came from there. Don't let her hear you talk about her hometown like that. What countess from the countryside? How unpleasant it sounds. The maids were startled and their faces showed lingering fear. Some of them even looked into the room with a guilty conscience. But when they realized that Scarlet didn't seem to be listening to them, they heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly turned back to ask, Bettina, quickly tell us what happened to the count. Since Scarlet was under house arrest in the courtyard of the castle, the maidservants naturally couldn't leave, except for Bettina, who had to go to the rose garden to see Her Majesty every once in a while. Girls of their age were full of vitality and curiosity, so they were even more attracted to the outside world, even if it was a small thing. Bettina was a little older, so when she saw the pitiful eyes of her companions, she could only reply, The Count arrested the local nobles in Saruf. When I went there, I saw Duke Pallet complaining to Her Majesty in the rose garden. She suddenly showed a clever smile and said disrespectfully to the Duke, You didn't see the Duke's flustered and exasperated look? I've never seen him like this before. Bettina, did you say that the Count went to Saruf? The maidservants seemed to be used to such news, and they didn't seem surprised at all. It seemed that since half a month ago, the southern nobles were beaten to a pulp, and it had become a common occurrence in the whole king's city. But they noticed something else and asked curiously, So, in less than a month, we will be able to see the Count? Before he completely infuriates Her Majesty, Betessa pouted. When Duke Pallet and Her Majesty were talking, she only dared to stand aside and listen with her head lowered. However, this did not prevent her from hearing how bad Her Majesty's mood was. Besides, she had secretly seen Her Majesty's expression later on. Her face was always cold, but today it was even colder than usual. It was enough to make people's teeth chatter. Bettina thought for a moment and added with a lingering fear, If Her Majesty doesn't hang the Count, maybe we will have a chance to see him. What are you talking about, Bettina? At this time a slightly low voice sounded. All the maidservants were startled. They were talking so intensely that they didn't even notice when Scarlet came in. The mountain maiden stood by the door of her room and looked at them, and the maidservants were like a flock of startled sparrows. They all shut their mouths and the room suddenly quieted down. Bettina glared at her disloyal companions and whispered to Scarlet, My lady. You're talking about Erewhon? Scarlet didn't care about the matter, but stared at Bettina and asked in a somewhat anxious tone. "Oh no, the Count must have heard us," Bettina thought. But she didn't dare to lie, so she answered honestly, "Yes, my lady." "Tell me the truth," Scarlet said with a pale face. In fact, she often couldn't sleep these days. Every time she closed her eyes, she would think of the Count, and it would disturb her. "We're talking about a Count from Erewhon." "A Count from Erewhon?" As soon as Scarlet heard this, she immediately rushed to Bettina's side and grabbed the round-faced maidservant's arm like a ghost and asked loudly. Bettina had never seen Scarlet like this and couldn't help but jump in fright. "Where did that Count come from?" "My lady, I don't know. Her Majesty and the nobles didn't mention it, so I didn't dare to ask," Bettina quickly replied. Scarlet pursed her lips and didn't say anything. The young girl's sharp premonition made her realize something, but she couldn't think of a good way to ask at the moment. But Tessa trembled as she looked at the Count. When she saw the look of confidence and desire in the Count's eyes, she seemed to have understood what was going on. She trembled as she asked, "Count, do you want to hear about his deeds?" Scarlet nodded seriously. "All right, it's like this." Bettina took a deep breath and slowly opened her mouth. After Duke Peruth left, Constance's expression became slightly better. At this time, the Imperial Chancellor, Fjodna Nydivan, who was known as Junior Nydivan, hurried into the Queen's private study in the Rose Garden. The supreme ruler of the Empire looked at him and asked, "What's wrong, Chancellor? Did the Count cause some trouble again?" Junior Nydivan looked at the Queen in surprise. Before he came, he heard from the Chamberlain that the Queen was furious, but now it seemed that was far from the truth. Not only was the Queen not angry, but she also seemed to be in a good mood. Even so, Junior Nydivan didn't dare to relax. He quickly bowed respectfully and answered with a little embarrassment, "Your Majesty, you are very accurate. Indeed, after the Count detained the nobles of Thuruf, a group of young people wanted to take revenge on him, but unfortunately they were all taken hostage. I heard that the nobles of the south were no longer angry with the Count and were discussing ransom for the hostages, but the old Duke didn't seem to be willing to do so." The old Duke he mentioned was naturally the previous head of the House of Peruth. The House of Peruth was the representative of the new nobles of the Cruz Empire. It was no secret that they had a close relationship with the nobles of the south. In fact, it was because of this that the Queen supported them to become an important force in the imperial court. "Which family's children were taken from?" Constance asked casually. "It was mainly the House of Alcorn and the House of Jean." "Your Majesty, the Duchess is from the House of Jean," Fjodna Nydivan reminded. "I don't need you to remind me. Of course I know," Her Majesty replied. "These self-righteous fellows dare to look down on the guests I invited. It's good to let them suffer a little." Junior Nydivan seemed to have understood the ins and outs of the matter. He quickly replied, "Your Majesty is right, but the Count is really too much. He doesn't give the Empire any face. The nobles of the Empire can't stand him fighting his way here." "Umph," the Silver Queen snorted softly. "It's normal for young people to be impetuous, but it's true that his grandfather was much calmer than him back then. It doesn't matter. A capable person can be forgiven for being arrogant and unruly. The Empire isn't so intolerant. But don't let him make a big deal out of it. He just wants to get our attention, but if every envoy group comes, the Empire won't be able to stand it. Let the local legions at the border be more vigilant. Even a mere Erewhon can step on their faces. Count Alcorn and Count Jean don't mind losing face." The Prime Minister of the Empire couldn't help but smile bitterly. "This Count is really... I don't know how to describe him. He actually did such a thing. Even I almost thought that he was crazy." "He's not crazy," Constance replied. "This Count knows the Empire very well. He knows that we won't do anything to him. Moreover, this little guy knows his limits. Outsiders might not be able to tell, but I don't believe that you can't, Prime Minister." A thin layer of cold sweat immediately appeared on Junior Nydivan's forehead. He knew in his heart that although the Empire's supreme ruler was conversing with him casually, the Nydivan family's position in the Queen's heart was deteriorating day by day. On the contrary, because of the series of things that Brando had caused, he had met the Queen more often, and the relationship between them had eased up a little. However, the Queen's words immediately put him on edge. He hurriedly replied carefully, "Your Majesty's eyes are like torches. That Count is, after all, that person's grandson." "Indeed." The Queen nodded as if she agreed. "Your Majesty, before I came, I heard that you were angry again." Junior Nydivan suddenly asked carefully, "What?" "Your Majesty, your health." "My health is very good. You don't have to worry about me, Prime Minister." Constance knew that this must be a message from Prime Minister Naidivan. Junior Naidivan's intelligence was not inferior to his father's, but he was much less courageous. I'm angry because of those useless nobles of the empire. Their faces have been trampled on. Instead of thinking about how to reclaim their glory, they want to tie their gains and losses to the empire. Cruz's people have not fallen to that extent. It's natural for them to want to take revenge on that count. I don't think Duke Palat will let this go, Your Majesty. Junior Naidivan shook his head and replied. I hope he doesn't cause too much trouble for me. Constance shook her head. Count Alcons and Count Jean know their limits. Junior Naidivan's answer did not match his heart. Constance looked at him and corrected him. I'm talking about him. The Prime Minister of the Empire was slightly startled and then smiled bitterly. Junior Naidivan stayed in the Rose Garden for half an hour and took time to report the situation in the west and east to the Supreme of the Empire. The Lion Beast men were still attacking the White Hart and Orcus fortresses. Compared to their decisiveness in assembling the army, the progress was slow. On the other hand, the Wind Elves persisted in their attacks in the wilderness of the Four Realms. The Red Army was one of the four main armies of the Empire, and their reputation was not undeserved. The mobilization within the Empire was nearing its end, and the atmosphere of war could be felt even in remote areas. After he said goodbye, Constance watched the Prime Minister of the Empire leave. When the study was empty, she gently tapped on the armrest of the chair and muttered to herself thoughtfully. Does he really know how to use the Heaven's armor? Did Jocelyn secretly go to Erewhon? No, he's not that shallow, Lady Gwendolen. I have a feeling that he's sending us a signal. What is he trying to say? Or is this the attitude of the people of Erewhon? Her cold voice echoed faintly in the empty study, but no one answered her question. Not only that. The story in the room had obviously been going on for some time, but it did not look like it was going to end anytime soon. Bettina continued, everyone thinks that the Count is crazy. He actually attacked one of the Empire's fortresses because he didn't receive the proper treatment. God, before this I always thought that we, the mountain people, were the most rebellious people of the Empire. I didn't expect that compared to the Count, we are nothing. I've long heard that the people of Erewhon have a great king. When he founded the country he swore that the people of Erewhon would independently protect their own people. I didn't expect it to be true. As she said that, the round-faced handmaiden could not help but sneak a glance at her liege. But she was disappointed to find that Scarlet was unmoved. She only asked blankly, and then? She sighed disappointedly and continued, and then of course the nobles of the Empire would not let it go. They gathered an army and wanted to teach this ignorant outsider a lesson. Of course the result was not what they wanted. As for what happened after that, I've already told you, Count. That Count naturally captured all of them. Not only that, he also took them as hostages and demanded a large sum of ransom from their families. He even named it, compensation for damage to reputation, or, compensation for mental damage, or something like that. Scarlet shuddered as if she had been electrocuted. She looked up at her handmaiden and asked in disbelief, You said compensation for mental damage? You didn't mention this to me before, Bettina? But that's not the point, Count. Bettina was baffled. But she did not notice that the Count in front of her was gritting his teeth. Once upon a time, she was the one who had been with the Count for the longest time. She had long gotten used to those strange terms. She used to think that it was the Count's only bad habit. But at this moment, those words that he once couldn't understand sounded so familiar to him. Bettina was still rambling on. In my opinion, the Count did not have to offend the nobles of the Empire. After all, he is an outsider. If he flaunts his power now, he will have to suffer in the future. Her Majesty the Queen has been angry a few times because of this, and a few dukes hate him so much that they want to grind their teeth. The only praiseworthy thing is that the Count is in the limelight. Now, in the vicinity of Rusta, I'm afraid that there are very few people who do not know him. I really don't understand what he is trying to do. Halfway through her words, she suddenly froze. She suddenly saw the Count in front of her crying. She hurriedly called out, Count, what happened to you? Scarlet shook her head hard. Because she understood. Everything he had done was just to tell her one thing. I'm already here, Scarlet. Like a promise. P.S. I wrote so late today. The sword spirit did not play much. Sob, sob, sob. I brought Scarlet along to beg for monthly votes. Also, regarding the ether dragon that someone asked about yesterday, the cost of mana is actually a card's esper ability. The cost of the ether dragon itself is 25 water. However, I also looked at the card's description, and there is actually a problem. I think it should be written as a barrier. Chapter 9:13. The autumn sunset in Anzaruta was very beautiful. The forest between the mountains blended with the mottled rusty red, like flowing colors on an oil canvas. It depicted the long and narrow foggy valleys of the Anzaruta region and the basin plains scattered among the hills. But in the late winter the scenery changed again. The forest took off its branches and leaves, and the bare woodland revealed the steep cliffs and precipitous cliffs. The snow was white, steep, and majestic, like a giant guarding the canyon basin. The delicacy and warmth of autumn suddenly turned into the firmness and majesty of winter. The change of the four seasons was the most fascinating natural scenery in this place. In the season away from war, adventurers from all over the world came to explore this place every year. But at this moment the Lion Army was approaching day by day, and the Wind Elves of Saint Tassol were also fighting with the Imperial Army in the wilderness of the Four Territories in the north. This charming mountain wilderness was unusually quiet. Brando, wrapped in a thick fur coat, stomped his feet in the snow under the pine trees. His eyes looked at the strip of plains under the foot of the mountain, or it should be called the basin, scattered among the rolling hills. But the further west he went, the lower the hills were, and the flatter it was gradually an endless plain. Then to the west, the mountains surged again, forming the shadow of the mountain far away in the horizon. That was the Broken Sword Mountain Range. "Let them shut themselves in their own castles and reflect on their actions," Brendel replied as he looked at the valley below his feet. He was answering Miss Eugenie's question about what to do with the nobles of Cruz that he had captured. The Duke's daughter stood in the woods, keeping a certain distance from him, as if she would be involved in any trouble in the future if she got a little closer. He didn't care about this and continued, "Earl Alcance and Earl Jean don't seem to be willing to pay us the ransom, so they are preparing to continue their revenge." The Duke's daughter stood there unwillingly. She had thought that this was just a normal group of envoys, but later it became a rebel army, and now it had become something similar to bandits. Ransom for hostages in the nobles' war. She was surprised that the Count could come up with such a name. But she couldn't say no. What could she do? She had already boarded the pirate ship and was tied to this damn diplomatic group. Even if she wanted to deny that all this was caused by Brando, well, she would have to wait until she met the Queen of Cruz or returned to Erwin. As for now, she couldn't leave the group and run back to Erwin alone, or simply surrender to the nobles of Cruz. Although she really wanted to do that a few times after thinking about the consequences of doing so, she gritted her teeth and endured it. "Count?" The Duke's daughter took a deep breath and finally asked, "I would like to ask what you want to do. You broke through a fortress of the Empire, humiliated the local nobles of Anzaruta, and defeated the Knight Regiment of Cruz. Well, let's forget about that. The former can be said to be a lesson to the arrogance of the Rogelia Legion. As the diplomatic group representing Erwin, we do have the right to do so. The latter is because they attacked us first and we just fought back, which is reasonable. But now, why are you doing this? You are actually asking for a ransom from Cruz?" "That's right, so what?" Brando asked back. Eugenie almost fainted. Normally, the nobles of Erwin would be more respectful to the nobles of Cruz, but this Count was different. It was as if he didn't want to embarrass the Cruz Empire enough. However, the nobles of Erwin could be shameless, but the Empire couldn't. The Empire had many vassal states, and many pairs of eyes were watching every move of this behemoth. How could it let a small country like Erwin ride on its head? At least the rulers of the Empire had a little bit of intelligence, and it wouldn't be difficult for them to realize this. And this was also what she didn't understand the most. What benefits did the Count have by doing this? To build up his reputation? Well, he was famous enough now. He was so famous that almost everyone from the south of Erwin to the capital of Cruz knew about him. In half of the Empire, and in the entire kingdom, all the nobles had reduced their outdoor activities since winter, so they should be talking about this Count's glorious deeds every day. But this kind of reputation probably didn't bring any benefits, because according to what she knew, even the ambassadors were betting on when this Count would be unlucky. Of course, whether Brando was unlucky or not had nothing to do with her, and she didn't need to worry about it. But what made this Duke's daughter worried was that they were in the same boat. If this Count's boat capsized, she would inevitably fall into the water. Thinking of this, she glared angrily at Brando, and the latter's nonchalant expression almost made her grit her teeth. Does this idiot know what he's doing? Eugenie became angrier the more she thought about it. She thought that this young and arrogant man had completely ruined this diplomatic mission. She originally wanted to join this diplomatic mission as a tourist, but she didn't expect it to turn into a war. "Count Brendel, I know that you have great power in Awen today, and I'm just an insignificant daughter of a duke. But I still want to remind you that there are many people in this envoy group. There are your students, the future king of the kingdom, your subordinates, and many innocent people. We don't want to be destroyed because of your stubbornness. Do you understand what I'm saying? Brendel's eyes were filled with anger. His eyes were filled with anger, and he looked at Brendel with disdain. Count Brendel, I know that you have great power in Aween today, and I'm just an insignificant daughter of a duke. But I still want to remind you that there are many people in this envoy group. Brando looked back at the duke's daughter, and thought that it must have been hard for her to endure for so long. Someone like Avram would have been so scared that he would hide in his carriage and not care about the outside world. It was funny how he followed the ostrich policy. Only then did he reply, "You're exaggerating, Miss Eugenie. I've never wanted to harm anyone." "I don't want to listen to these pompous words, Count. I've had enough. You said that you know what you're doing, but please tell me, why didn't you let those nobles, the Alcons and the Jean families go? Why did you ask for ransom from their families instead?" asked the duke's daughter impatiently. Hearing this question, Brando's face became stern. "Miss Eugenie, although I accept your opinion, I still want to tell you one thing. These people are now my captives. As for why they became my captives, it's because they provoked us. We didn't invade their territory for no reason. They want to take revenge for the failure of the Black Sword Rampart. Logically speaking, the Empire is the one who is in the wrong, not us. So, since they plan to bully the weak from the start, they should have been mentally prepared for this." He patted the snowflakes on his fur collar. In fact, with his strength, he didn't need to wear such thick winter clothes. He just didn't want to appear too special. Besides, people were lazy and hated work. If he could be warmer, he didn't need to make himself look like an ascetic. Then Brando continued, "As for what you said about me asking them to pay the ransom for the hostages, isn't it natural? Are you saying that the historical war between the Erewhon and Cruz nobles is so noble that they don't have to pay the ransom?" "You're twisting words." Since she had completely let it go, the duke's daughter no longer tried to use any euphemism. She had read as many books as Brando, so she directly replied, "Count, you and I both know that they are from Cruz. The disputes between Cruz and Cruz, the disputes between Erewhon and Erewhon, and the disputes between Erewhon and Cruz are different. In name, the people of the kingdom and the empire are born equal under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But in reality, this is just an empty statement. Everyone knows that the empire doesn't have to give face to the kingdom, but the kingdom can't not give face to the empire. Today you're happy, but tomorrow the empire will wait for an opportunity to take revenge. What will we do then?" "I don't believe that you don't know this, Count. You don't have to pretend to be crazy. Outsiders call you crazy and give you the nickname, Crazy Count. They call you the Sword Saint of the Gates, but the people in the envoy group can see it clearly. You know better than anyone that you have a lot of capable people. Even if you can't see this, I think they will remind you. But your subordinate, the wizard named the Shire, and the elven knight lady, they are very smart, but they let you do whatever you want. This shows that you already know that everything you do has a clear purpose." Eugenie replied coldly, "But this purpose, other than you and your people, you have kept all of us in the dark. You said that you are fighting for the reputation of the kingdom, but you are treating all of us as fools." At this point, Brando understood that the duke's daughter was really here to lay her cards on the table. He nodded and said, "All right, you're right. Everything I've done is indeed for another purpose." Eugenie looked at him coldly as if to say, "You better tell me everything clearly or I won't play with you. If you don't want to lose, there is a third way other than a draw or a win, and that is to flip the table." "But Miss Eugenie, you are still mistaken about one thing." Brando shook his head again. Eugenie looked at him suspiciously, as if she was wondering what the Count was up to. Brando looked back at the valley and then replied, "Erewhon's strength is not important to you, but it is very important to me. You may find it unbelievable, but I wanted to teach the Rogerians a lesson at the Black Sword Fortress for a legitimate reason. As for why I did this, it was precisely to make the Empire unable to retaliate against us." He paused for a moment as if waiting for the duke's daughter to digest his words, and then continued, "Do you think that if we stop now, the nobles of the Empire will let us go? If we return the hostages in our hands, they will let us leave Rosef smoothly? Then I can only say that you are thinking too much. Miss Eugenie, you are very smart, but your understanding of the Empire is often influenced by others. I have already told you that the Empire is only SOSO. But if we return the hostages in our hands today unharmed, won't we be telling them that they can provoke us without any cost?" Brando shook his head. "This is impossible. I want them to understand that every time they provoke me, they will feel the pain until they can't bear the loss." Hearing this, the duke's daughter felt that the Count was being stubborn. She couldn't help but ask coldly, "All right, my lord. Perhaps what you said makes sense, but have you ever thought that this matter will only get bigger and bigger? Do you know who is behind the Alcos family and the Jean family? It is Duke Pallet, and the Pallet family can be said to be the most powerful noble family in the empire. If they come to the stage to deal with you, Count, can you still make such a bold statement to make them feel the pain?" There was indeed such a possibility. Although Brando was confident, he was not arrogant enough to claim that he could challenge a colossus like the Pallet family. But things would not develop to that point. He shook his head again. "Don't worry, Miss Eugenie, things will not develop to that point." "What makes you say that?" the Duke's daughter asked in annoyance. "Based on your so-called intuition? You don't believe me?" Brando raised his eyebrows. "Then how about we make a bet?" "What bet?" Eugenie said in a huff. "You help me convince the nobles of Cruz that I will do what I say. If they can't pay the ransom, I will tie them up and take them to Rushta. I will take them to see Her Majesty and reason with Her Majesty." Brando replied. The Duke's daughter looked at him in surprise. "You still want to make things worse? Are you crazy?" "I'm not crazy. Didn't you say that I understand?" Brando looked back at the Duke's daughter and asked in a provocative tone, "What, you don't dare to make this bet with me?" "Why not?" Eugenie gritted her teeth and replied in annoyance, "But you only said half of it. If I do it, what about you?" Brando replied, "If you can do it, I promise you that after this matter, it will not affect me, you, the whole delegation, and the kingdom at all. Not only that, this mission will be an unprecedented success, and you will also gain the reputation you want. At least your father will not marry you to some unknown nobleman so early. Maybe some famous scholar will take a fancy to your talent and accept you as his disciple. Then you will be able to fulfill your wish." The Duke's daughter was obviously shocked by this sentence. She could not help but look at Brando with great shock. "You, how do you know? Did you use some evil magic on me?" "I didn't." Brando smiled mockingly. "I bribed your maid." "Shameless." The Duke's daughter finally could not help but curse. Brando laughed in his heart. He did not have the time to bribe a maid. He only occasionally learned about this young lady's deeds. In his previous life she was just an ordinary NPC. His understanding of this young lady was actually limited to this. He just used it casually, but he did not expect that it would really scare her. He smiled and continued, "How about it? Now it is good for both of us. If you turn back now, whether you go to Cruz or return to Erewhon, you will not be able to escape the blame. The crime of offending the Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire will eventually fall on your head. But if in the future I have some merit, you will not be able to get a share because of your hesitation today." Eugenie looked at him and replied with gritted teeth, "What kind of merit can a person like you have? It is really the misfortune of the kingdom. But since I promised to make a bet with you, I will naturally do it." She paused for a moment and suddenly became a little suspicious. "You're not telling me this because you've found your conscience. But then again, you seem to have better people around you to complete this task. Why do you want me to do it? That wizard called the Shire and that elf lady, they are loyal to you. Aren't they better people?" Brando could not help but feel a little embarrassed. He thought to himself, "Do I look so untrustworthy?" She even doubted this. He thought for a moment and replied, "It is because the Shire is loyal to me that they are even more unsuitable for this task." "What?" The Duke's daughter was puzzled. "What do you want me to do?" "I forgot to explain to you that I want you to convince the Kurlutzian nobles, and at the same time, you have to pretend to let one or two of them go, and at least make them believe that you and I are not in cahoots. Yes, just like what you're thinking now, you just have to explain to them that I'm the only one who's going crazy, and the rest of the envoy group is being held hostage by me. Just tell them exactly what I'm saying, and then let them go to deliver the message." Brando looked at Eugenie, who was staring at him with her mouth agape, and could not help but shake his head. "Don't look at me like that. I know that this is what you are thinking now." "You do have some self-awareness," the Duke's daughter replied, gritting her teeth. "But I don't understand why you're doing this. Isn't your purpose to stop those Kurlutzians from coming to trouble us? But it looks like you're afraid that your trouble isn't big enough?" Brando raised a finger and shook it at her. "Because to beat a snake you have to beat it to death. It is that simple." Chapter 9:14. In Wonde, the Sabbath day marked the end of the year. Both commoners and nobles would gradually reduce their activities after this day. It was as if the hustle and bustle of the year had died down during this month. People began to hold all kinds of celebrations and banquets to bid farewell to the old and welcome the new year. From the northernmost city of 10 Arms to the southern border of Erewhon, Silman and Abies Castle, Every household began to prepare and pray for the coming year. They prayed that the gods would bless them with peace and prosperity in the coming year. However, it seemed that ever since the end of the Year of Swords, an insignificant conflict between the border of the Kingdom of Erewhon and the Cruz Empire, a farce began to unfold from the southern border of Cruz to the northern border, breaking the peace that should have been there in the past. Since the month of Frost, people seemed to have gotten used to the breaking news coming from the southern border one after another. First, it was that the Kingdom of Erewhon had captured the fortress of the Empire, and a count from Erewhon had tried to challenge the Empire's authority. However, in the subsequent rumors, the count became the side with justice. What he did in the Black Sword Fortress was just to teach some arrogant nobles a lesson. In this era, the pride of the people of Cruz did not degenerate to the point that they needed to show their superiority over a small country. On the contrary, the magnanimity of a large country made the citizens of the empire value moral righteousness and legitimacy more. Therefore, they were more willing to stand on Brando's side to fight against the arrogant, stubborn and arrogant nobles of the empire. Therefore, every time Brando won a victory, the commoners and even the lower nobles of the empire would applaud him. We should teach those nobles a lesson and make them understand. This was the common view of the lower class of the empire. However, it did not mean that the upper class of the empire had lost the support of the people and that the pyramid structure was on the verge of collapse. As long as Brando raised his arm, the empire would fall apart. Most of the people had the mentality of being indifferent and gloating over the misfortune of others. This kind of rebellious counterattack was always something that the commoners liked to see. Of course, there was a small number of conspirators who were eager to take action and even planned a few small rebellions. However, these unlucky fellows who misjudged the situation were caught by the Silver Queen and organized several operations to eliminate dissidents. In this respect, the Supreme of the Empire indeed had to thank Brando. Therefore, the southern part of the empire was unprecedentedly lively, and the center of the empire was unprecedentedly stable. In any case, regardless of whether he was willing or not, Brando and his diplomatic group continued to advance to the north. Rumors of the Count, big and small, were still converging toward the center of the empire from all directions. On the last day of the month of the Winter Harp, St. Tassol's Samian festival, which was known as the Revival celebration in other regions. After Brando defeated the private army of the empire's nobles, a famous knight order composed of the local gentry's children, the Solstice Knight Order, and the Anzaruta Local Defense Legion led by Count Jean and Count Alcorn, the size of the diplomatic group had expanded from the original medium-sized size of 100 people to a large convoy of hundreds of people. In addition to the carriages of the diplomatic group, there were also more than a dozen large caravans behind the convoy. Inside were the detained nobles of the empire, old and young, and most of them were famous in history. At the beginning, this hostage convoy only had 1 or 2 carriages. However, after every battle, 1 or 2 more carriages would be added to the convoy, and finally, it formed the current long line of carriages. As for these nobles of the empire, Brando did not make things difficult for them. At least, he allowed them to maintain a basic level of dignity, and even allowed them to keep their attendants and personal attendants. Of course, these attendants' abilities were limited to running errands, preparing food for their masters, and solving the problems of cold and living. In this way, Brando did not even need to worry about the food of these captives. They could solve the problem by themselves. Of course, he did not exclude the fact that there were some hardliners who wanted to create trouble for him. They would rather starve to death than consume the rations of Brando's diplomatic group. His method of dealing with them was very simple. He just provided these people with basic rations. In the end, after 2 meals of hard bread, these people went to contact their attendants with tears streaming down their faces. Brando was not worried that these people would escape. There were magic alarms provided by the wizards around the convoy 24 hours a day. There were also gargoyles patrolling the sky. In this snow-covered wilderness, how far could ordinary people run? At first, there were a few people who tried to escape. Brando did not even stop them. In the end, a few days later, these unlucky people returned to the convoy, cold and hungry. They felt that they wanted to continue being captives. Brando deliberately relaxed the surveillance of these unlucky people in the convoy. As a result, through the mouths of these unlucky people, soon everyone knew what happened to them. For a moment, it was a good deterrent effect. The second wave of escape came when the diplomatic group passed by a relatively prosperous area near Ruzov. The successful escape of a few nobles was like a shot in the arm to the hundreds of captives in the convoy. After that, they began to escape on a large scale. Every evening, there would be an endless stream of people escaping the convoy, but almost all of them were caught without exception. After that, the imperial nobles who did not give up, began to contact people outside the convoy through their attendants and launched a battle of wits and courage to rescue the hostages again and again. The whole process was full of the wisdom and whimsy of the nobles. For example, a passing circus invited Brando the Count to visit, or a distressed noble daughter asked for help from a foreigner. It was full of the romanticism of the night. Some of them even made Brando laugh and cry. As for the result, after Brando severely taught a few nobles who pretended to be bandits, merchants, prostitutes, mercenaries, noble family members and even circus members, the caravans behind the diplomatic group increased. After a month of back and forth, the imperial nobles finally realized that their futile escape plan would not work in the eyes of Brando. Although the Count looked no more than 20 years old, he was as shrewd as a veteran mercenary group leader who had walked the continent for a lifetime. The disguises and tricks that adventurers, mercenaries, and nightingales were used to were almost non-existent in front of him. Of course, what they did not expect was that while teaching these whimsical fellows a lesson, Brando was also secretly laughing at these people for playing these tricks with him. These were things that he had played too many times in his previous life. In the later half of the world, the player adventurers played much more interesting games than these childish nobles. Some of the things they did not even think of. In the second era, there was a famous case where a player, in order to ambush the Mountain King Sherry Fang, used an illusion to create an identical stone mountain fortress less than 5 miles away from Alice. Then he used a barrier spell to hide the entire Alice from the map and make it disappear. No one would have thought that someone would play such a big trick under the eyes of so many people. Even a famous NPC like the Mountain King Sherry Fang was the same. If not for the Players Guild making a mistake at that time, perhaps the great cause of killing Sherry Fang would have been completed by them. It was obvious that the tricks of these nobles were really boring in Brando's eyes. Sophie had been a leader for almost 30 years in the game in his previous life. This was not a particularly outstanding experience among the players, but it was very impressive among the NPCs. Even old mercenaries like Rabin and Yuta might not be able to achieve this kind of experience. Not to mention that he had an even older leader, Maynard, by his side. Although the female knight was not willing to admit her identity, this did not prevent her from using her experience. The two often stayed in the carriage all night to study the tricks of these nobles, and the result was naturally that some unlucky bastards would be completely taken advantage of. After leaving Ruzef, the diplomatic party began to gradually leave Anzaruta's territory. At this time, some of the small noble families in the long convoy finally could not take it anymore. They began to ask for ransom one after another. Brando was not particularly difficult for these people. After receiving the money, he generously released them. This kind of generosity won him a reputation among some of the small nobles. The rumors about the Sword Saint and the Mad Earl were not as bad as they were at the beginning. Of course, this was only one part of the reason. On the other hand, the nobles that Miss Eugenie released under his instructions finally began to play their role. Under their exaggerated propaganda, Brando's identity successfully evolved into the image of a foreigner who had different rules and regulations, evolving into the image of a great demon king. In fact, there was nothing wrong with their propaganda. After all, if they did not describe Brando as sinister and cunning, and how good at playing with people's hearts, wouldn't it seem that the people who were caught by him were very incompetent? After all, losing to a powerful opponent may mean that you are weak and incompetent. Losing to an intelligent opponent may mean that you are a complete fool. Losing to an experienced opponent may mean that you are naive and childish. But if your opponent is despicable and shameless, at least you can win the sympathy of the audience. After all, kindness is not sinful, isn't it? So in their description, the treatment and dignity that Brando gave to the nobles disappeared. The nobles who were caught by Brando lived a life worse than hell every day. They were poorly dressed and had no food to eat. Although people probably wondered why a dignified Count Erwin would rob them of their clothes and rations, such a description was in line with the speculation of the people of the empire about foreign barbarians. So these noble statements successfully aroused the indignation of almost all the nobles of the empire in Anzaruta. Of course, this indignation had existed from the beginning, but Count Jean and Count Alcorn had not figured out how to stand on moral injustice so that they could continue to attack Erwin's envoys. Now, under the hands-on guidance of the Duchess of Vero, they finally found a reason to start a war. Although this reason sounded ridiculous and unbelievable, it should be enough to convince Her Majesty the Queen. So, under the watchful eyes of the entire empire, the two counts began to regain their dignity. As described at the beginning, this farce that started from the border of the empire all the way to the hinterland of the empire was once again staged. This was obviously the second season of this farce. As for whether there would be a third and fourth season, it was hard to say. Erwin's envoys finally passed through the last barrier of the Anzaruta Mountains. They were now at a location called Floating Cloud Hills on the Empire's map. For the Empire, it was quite a famous place. In the War of the Holy Saints, this was the starting point of the Great Plains. Looking east from here, there was an endless wilderness, which was the most southwest of the wilderness of 4 territories. And north of here, through a long and narrow corridor called the Evergreen Corridor, it was connected to the famous Flower Ridge in the north. And east of here, close to the Broken Sword Mountains, was the Rokizi Highland, which was the closest place to the Great Plains of Toquinen. At the intersection of the mountains, there were countless fortresses and ramparts that blocked the attacks from the Lion Beastmen. In other words, this place was probably the closest place to the war for the Empire at this moment, except for the wilderness of 4 territories and the eastern foot of the Broken Sword Mountains. Since July, this place had entered a state of alert. Today there were no signs of festivities in other places. Between towns and cities and between commercial stations, there were few pedestrians. Instead, patrols began to appear more frequently. This place was currently a military depot for the 2 battlefields, and also one of the weakest links of the Empire. If it was a normal day, Brando was really worried that the 2 counts of Anzaruta would find a way to persuade some of the great imperialists from the 2 legions in the north and south to pursue and intercept him. But now the Empire soldiers were fighting a bloody battle, and obviously, it was impossible for them to participate in the petty games of these nobles. At this time, Brando had finally contacted some of the imperial nobles who were biased towards him through Lenneret's forces in the Empire. But these nobles he first contacted were not the hardcore supporters of the eldest son of the Emperor. After all, the military nobles' sphere of influence was mostly in the north and south, which was the traditional sphere of influence of the local nobles and the Holy Cathedral. And these nobles that Brando contacted happened to be some of the local forces who were emotionally biased towards the eldest son of the Emperor. They had a common characteristic, which was that their stance was wavering, and their strength was far from enough to affect the situation of the Empire. To be more precise, they were just there for show. But these nobles were very important to Brando at this moment. Through them, Brando finally learned some of the internal situation of the Empire at this time, especially what happened after Veronica and Mangrove returned to the Empire. After the changes in the history of the Empire, although Brando still had a forward-looking judgment of the customs of the Empire and the habits of the nobles in handling affairs, he was rarely in the dark about the specific direction of the Empire after the big explosion and before the Holy War. In fact, since he returned to this era, this was the first time he encountered such a situation. And after contacting these small families, he finally understood what happened after that. Just as Veronica expected, she was stripped of her military power as soon as she returned to the Empire. However, the Silver Queen did not punish the Iris family because of this. Instead, she let Veronica's brother succeed as the head of the Legion and take over the position of the head of the Iris family. On the surface, she did this to appease the military forces and not offend the people she would need. But Brando knew that there was a deeper reason. He knew very well that Lady Veronica was actually just a scapegoat in the whole incident. In the eyes of those who did not know the truth, this incident was a punishment for Veronica's carelessness. But in fact, this was just a cover. The Silver Queen was well aware of her role in this incident, and it was inevitable that she would feel guilty for appeasing the Iris family. But what puzzled Brando was that Veronica was not released back to her own territory. Instead, she was placed under house arrest in the imperial capital. Could it be that the Silver Queen was so heartless that she wanted to punish the head of the Legion? No matter how he thought about it, he did not think it was necessary. The Silver Queen knew Veronica's ability, and it seemed like there was no need for her to offend Veronica. But when Brando heard the news, he did not think too much about it. It was not until Maynard reminded him that there might be a conspiracy behind this that he realized that something was wrong. After Maynard learned the truth, she told him, "Her Majesty the Emperor of the Cruz people will make a big move." What's going on? Brando knew that his political experience was not much better than the righteous Knight Ike, so he did not feel that anything was wrong and asked directly. Maynard glanced at him with a rare look of disappointment in her eyes. This gaze was very similar to the one Maynard used to look at him. Think about it. What kind of person is Veronica? How can her brother be so successful? Since you and I both know this, how can the Silver Queen not know? Her actions are equivalent to leaving the Azure Army empty. What kind of forces are in the central region of the Empire? Without the Azure Army, the balance of power will be easily broken. A mature politician will not make such a risky move. But since she has done so, it means that she has ulterior motives. Based on the logic of risk and reward, her actions will not be small. The female knight paused for a moment before replying indifferently, "It's just that we have too little information to deduce what she wants." Brando's heart skipped a beat when he heard this. He looked at the knight, who was usually quiet and only spoke a few words when they were discussing tactics to deal with the nobles. For a moment he felt a sense of familiarity with her. When she said those words, it was just like the scene when Maynard analyzed the mission for them. It was just that at that time, Maynard Allium Japonicum was much gentler. He pursed his lips and seriously considered Maynard's words in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. However, whether the Supreme One's actions were good or bad for them was just like what Maynard said. Due to the lack of information, it was impossible to deduce in a short period of time. "This matter is getting more and more complicated," Brando couldn't help but mutter to himself, "but His Majesty's actions probably won't have anything to do with what we're going to do next. What we need to do now is to deal with the two counts. Only by doing this will we be able to take the initiative in the upcoming trip to the Empire." The female knight did not comment, but Medisha answered, "Sir Overlord, I think it's a good thing to focus on one thing, but it's best that we find out more information in this area." Brando nodded this time. In fact, he already had a suitable candidate in mind. Speaking of which, she was the only person he knew in the Empire. Coincidentally, they were very close to each other in terms of geographical distance. Chapter 9:15. Brando naturally thought of the Duke's daughter, Miss Farina. She was Veronica's student, and at the same time, was at the top of the Imperial Noble Circle. She was the most suitable person to get information from. What was even more valuable was that there was no real conflict of interest between him and the Duke's daughter, and he did not have to worry that she would deceive him for no reason. Although the Duke's daughter was arrogant and rude in the loop of trade winds, she did not look like a cunning person. Besides, he really needed someone to prove from the side whether the Crown Prince's supporters in the south were reliable or not. When he dealt with the local nobles of the Empire, he had always cleverly avoided the topic of the Crown Prince. He described himself as a friend of Veronica and Mangrove's overseas military forces in the north of the Empire. This identity naturally made him feel close to the nobles who had a good impression of the Crown Prince. In addition, Lenoret had exposed some of his loyal informants to Brando. Through these people, Brando and his envoy group easily established a relationship with the Crown Prince's faction in the Empire. But these people were not reliable after all, and Brando was very clear about this. He immediately wrote a letter to Farina. There was still a long journey from Floating Cloud Hill to Flower Leaf Ridge, and he did not expect to receive a reply for a while. But at this time, the nobles in the south brought him a new message. This message was also something Brando had asked them to help find out. It was mainly about the current Holy War. Almost at the same time when the Holy War began, Erwin's envoy group set off for the Empire. When they passed through the bustling areas of Ampere Seal, they could more or less inquire about the war. But after entering the Balta Plateau and then the Anzaruta Mountains, these uninhabited areas were really isolated from the rest of the world. For the past 2 months, except for the conflict with Earl Jean and Earl Alcorn, almost all the information about the outside world was completely blank. According to the nobles and crews, since the big explosion in July and August, the revenge of the Lion People and the Wind Elves at the border opened the curtain of the Holy War. This war was carried out from October to November, and both sides were in a stalemate. It was completely silent in the last month of the Year of Swords. The farce between Brando and the southern nobles of the Empire seemed to have attracted everyone's attention for a while, and it made the ongoing war seem insignificant. After the first round of attack in the wilderness of Four Realms, the Wind Elves began to withdraw. After all, this was a revenge action based on the tragedy of Perkins. Although it was seen by all parties as the curtain of the Holy War, the curtain had not been lifted yet. Compared to the private actions of the local legions, the two huge empires still needed time to react to this war. This was a unique phenomenon in the Third Holy War. It was as if the limbs of the body were already moving, but the brain was still operating slowly. On the other hand, the Lion People's side was even more strange. When the people of the land began to attack the Rokizi Highlands and the Broken Sword Mountains, they seemed to have fallen into silence. It was unknown whether it was because of the fear of failure or because of the logistical difficulties in the winter, but they did not move an inch. This news, except for the part about Toquinen, was not fundamentally different from what Brando and the rest heard 2 months ago in Ampere Seal. However, the offensive actions of the Wind Elves were predictable. In this era, except for Madara, the central authority of the empires was in fact very limited. Among them, the Cruz Empire was slightly stronger, and the Wind Elves of Saint Tassol were slightly weaker. This was because the Saint Tassol still faced the problem of conflict between the two main races, humans and elves. This problem had not been resolved in Brando's era until the Slate War. Fanzan was even worse. Fanzan was a loose alliance, with the Aenir as the main body. Internally there were also countries like the Grecius Knight Regiment. The north was a fertile land with a city-state system. If it were not for the power of the Templar Church, it would be almost impossible to call it a country. Of course, it was very rare for the domestic situation to be as bad as that of the Kingdom of Erwin. The three empires were each carrying out internal reforms. Among them, the Wind Elves and Fanzan were at the forefront. The Cruz Empire and the Silver Queen were currently trying to create a highly centralized empire. Lenoret was also ambitious, but for the time being, these huge empires still relied on the local nobles to maintain their operations. The revenge of the Elves of Saint Tassol was initiated by the commander and lord of the Perkins Legion. Although it was in fact tacitly approved by the Elven court, the counterattack launched by the Cruz Empire's Red Legion was in fact initiated by the Silver Queen, but it was also tacitly approved by the Supreme One. Even the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not object. The trick was that both sides had the intention to continue the war, but both sides were not fully prepared. Therefore, it was predictable that the Wind Elves would suddenly pause after launching their attack. However, the Lionmen's movements were very strange. Toquinen was a tribal kingdom. This kingdom consisted of the Lionmen and the Dwarves, as well as some orcs and were-creatures. The Lionmen, Dwarves, orcs and were-creatures formed clans and tribes of various sizes scattered across the plains and the mountains in the north. They had a king who was the great chieftain of all the clans and tribes in name. They also had a spiritual leader who was the high priest of the Temple of the Earth or the Prophet. In theory, under the call of the chieftain and the prophet, these tribal people gathered together and decided to launch a holy war. This meant that the Golden Kingdom was ready for the war. However, the current situation was that the Lionmen, Dwarves, orcs and were-creatures had gathered together to form an army. However, this army was hesitant to move forward. This situation was promoted by the Empire as the Rokizi Highlands and the Broken Sword Mountains Fortress Group were not good at sieges. Therefore, these barbarians were unable to launch an effective attack on the Empire. They could only look at the walls and sigh. When winter was over, they would naturally be unable to hold on and return. Most of the nobles who brought this information to Brando believed this. The Empire's walls were high and the city was strong. Unless it was an opponent of the same level as Saint Tassol, how could they possibly break through the Empire's fortress group? However, Brando really wanted to remind these blindly optimistic nobles that one of the Empire's fortresses had been breached not long ago, and the one who did it was the Count of a small country at the border. Now that the Count was right in front of them, shouldn't they think twice before acting so arrogantly? But in the end he shook his head. The arrogance of the Empire's people was a tradition. It was as if it had become a deep-rooted concept. Once such a concept was formed, it was basically no different from superstition. They would not listen to different opinions. However, he and Maynard knew very well that the Golden Mane Lion-Mane Beastmen of Toquinen were not good at sieges, but there were also the Mountain Dwarves in the army. The Mountain Dwarves were a tribe of dwarves that lived in the mountains of Wonde. In fact, they only existed in the Temple of the Earth, in the Broken Sword Mountains north of the White Plains. They had been living there since the Dark Age. They dug through the mountains, dug tunnels, and were good at building underground palaces and halls. They had considerable knowledge in architecture and mechanics. They were both craftsmen and warriors. They were the best at sieges, especially digging tunnels. The Cruz people seemed to have neglected the craftsmen and warriors who were best at sieges. As for another popular rumor, it was said that the Toquinen army was stagnant because of the winter supply line. In fact, it was nonsense. Nomads and clansmen never needed a supply line. Their habit was to plunder along the way and raise their own supplies. For such an army, it would be strange if they suddenly stopped. Brando looked at the map again and again, but in the end he still could not figure it out. But he was thinking about something else. In history, when the Holy War began, the Lion-Mane Beastmen attacked fiercely. They once broke through the Rokizi Highlands and the Broken Sword Mountains. At the most critical moment, they even threatened the War of the Red Army in the Wilderness of Four Territories. But at that time the Empire's players were too fierce. They used their bodies to delay the Lion-Mane Beastmen's advance to the north. It was said that it was the first time the players changed the course of history in the game. The average level of the players in that era was not higher than level 35, and the Toquinen side also had a large army of players. That battle could only be attributed to the unity and strength of the players on the Empire's side. Since then, The Lion-Mane Beastmen could only look at the Broken Sword Mountains and the northern plains that were divided into two by Anzaruda. Brando was now wondering if history would repeat itself. Of course, he was not talking about the history of the Lion-Mane Beastmen being defeated by the players, but the history of the Lion-Mane Beastmen breaking through the Rokizi Highlands and the Broken Sword Mountains. As far as he knew, in the battle between the Lion-Mane Beastmen and the Broken Sword Mountains, the role of the Tokunin players was limited. This was because the main force of the siege was the dwarves, and the dwarves were one of the races with the least number of players. After all, the Lion-Mane Beastmen were tall and mighty, so the dwarves were not. Not to mention, even the female dwarves had to grow beards. A race that could not attract female players certainly could not attract male players. This was the iron law of history. And the significance of this news to Brando was that if history was not disturbed, then the wound in this world would be more likely to repeat itself. But when he asked Maynard about this possibility, she denied it. Now, the Holy War is 3 years ahead of the one I saw in my dream, Brando. The female knight looked at his face and replied, "This is because of us. You should know this. The situation now is completely different from that time." Brando did not see it that way. The Holy War was ahead of schedule, but this was not necessarily a bad thing for Tokunin. The Lion-Mane Beastmen mobilized quickly for war, and they did not have to prepare logistical support. Besides, they were very mobile in the grasslands, but for the Empire, this meant that they had less time to prepare. So the current situation seemed to be more advantageous for the Lion-Mane Beastmen than in history. He mentioned this to Maynard, but the female knight shook her head. It seems so, but the Lion-Mane Beastmen's actions are very unusual. They have not behaved like this in previous wars. In that dream it was even more so. The battle where they took down the Rokizi Highland and the Broken Sword Mountains was not very clean, but the whole process was very active, which is completely different from the current situation. Brando could not help but frown when he heard this. He knew that Allium Japonicum was better than him when it came to the details of the game's history in the year of Spring Dawn. His knowledge of that history came from the forums and the memoirs of some later players, but for Allium Japonicum, most of it was her own experience. There was a key difference. Before level 30, the game content and story that players came into contact with were very low level, and Allium Japonicum was one of the few players above level 30 in that era. After listening to Maynard's description, Howrin could not help but purse his lips, wondering where the difference came from. Maynard saw him thinking and reminded him, "You're thinking about the Lion-Mane Beastmen in Tokunin?" Brando nodded. He did not hide anything from Maynard. These days, he had gotten used to discussing such matters with the female knight. It was as if he had returned to the past and he was looking forward to it. In history, cruise adventurers, people like us, delayed the Tokunin army until July until the White Legion joined the battle. The war started in May, but that was between spring and summer. In winter, the White Legion would be further south in Lieru, and their reaction time might be faster. We just need to find a way to delay the Lion-Mane Beastmen's pace and we will succeed. He paused for a moment before continuing, "You should have seen my plan. I need a certain amount of prestige. My grandfather's identity is a great advantage, but Brando is too young, so young that it is almost impossible for him to inherit Darius's position in the Imperial Army. But fortunately his starting point is high enough. People are always willing to believe in some superstitions. If I can do the right thing and confirm some of their visions, then I still have a good chance of gaining a higher position in the army in the future." According to Veronica, the situation in the Empire is very turbulent, and history is completely different from what you and I have seen in our dreams. Whether it is the Queen, the Prince, Duke Ludwig, Bankel's military forces, the Holy Cathedral, or us, if we want to gain the upper hand in this game of chess, we have to be able to determine our own destiny. The only way is to be a chess player, not a chess piece. I was a little hesitant at first, but Scarlett's experience finally made me decide to take this path. I was too naive in the past, thinking that Erwin could settle down in a corner and find his own path in the Black Forest. But in fact, when the tide comes, no one can escape. You and I have both witnessed this, so there are some things that I have to do now, and I have no choice but to do them. Brando replied in a deep voice, "Teaching the nobles in the south a lesson is just the beginning. I need them as a stepping stone to let the Empire know of Erwin's existence. But the only thing that can really connect Brando and Darius is the Holy War. But currently we are very weak, and it is impossible for us to find trouble with the Wind Elves in St. Tassel. Our only chance is in Tokunin." Maynard was silent for a while after listening to Brando's words. "You did all this just to save a mountain girl?" she suddenly asked. "From a personal point of view, yes," Brando replied. "It's just like how you planned to save us from Madara in the Bunasan. You lacked rationality, but it was natural for you to do so. You saved us because you were our leader and you promised to protect every member of your team. I saved Scarlet for the same reason. I promised to give her freedom and hope for the future, so I had to do it. This is an obsession. Maynold listened to Brando's words, and her mouth moved as if she was trying to think of a way to refute him. She knew that he was referring to another part of her experience, but instinctively, the female knight did not acknowledge that it was her. She thought that it was just a dream of hers. But this time she didn't refute him. Instead, she replied as such. This obsession is the driving force behind my return to this world, Brando replied. I don't want to give up a second time, Senior. I'm not. Maynold finally sighed. Well, I have to tell you one thing, Brando. You rely too much on everything you've seen in your dreams. I don't know why you always believe in that dream so much, as if it had really happened before. But a dream is a dream after all. For me, the greatest benefit of it is that it gave me a different life experience, allowing me to mature quickly and stand out from my peers. But I never thought of confirming anything from this dream because if I did, this world would seem too illusory to me. And in you, I seem to see another version of myself. You always act with great foresight, but the more you rely on that dream, the more you can't free yourself from it. For you, for a lord, for a count of the empire, the female knight looked into Brando's eyes, paused, and then said word by word, it's too childish. Brando was completely stunned. He never thought that Maynold would say such a thing to him, but her tone was completely like the person who taught him how to be a qualified commander. But, he replied. Maynold seemed to have expected what he was going to say. She shook her head and said, actually, you already know what to do, Sophie. Brando froze as if he was struck by lightning. He looked at the female knight as if he was possessed. It's because of your dependence on that dream that you can't trust your own judgment. Maynold shook her head and changed back to the way she addressed him. Do you understand now? Brando was stunned for a long while before he seemed to understand what the female knight meant. He looked at her deeply and said, you mean I should analyze what the lion people in Toquinen will do? Didn't you analyze it well just now? I've taught you how to analyze the mission and how to plan the mission. Today at least I can see that you've learned very well. Maynold smiled. If I were your allium japonicum, I would be very pleased, but unfortunately I'm not. And you are not Sophie Brando. You have more knowledge than even Sophie has. You are the Count of Erewhon, you should understand this. Brando took a deep breath. He shifted his gaze back to the map. Well, I understand, he replied softly. All in all, we still have to prioritize the mission. Since the guests have arrived first as the host, we naturally can't neglect our guests. This is the demeanor of the nobles of Erewhon. Maynold nodded. Exactly. In the last 10 days of the month of Dongqin, the eyes of the entire empire were focused on a war that was both unexpected and expected. On this day, the army gathered by Count Jean and Count Alcorn finally arrived at Floating Cloud Hill. Chapter 9:16. The vast starry sky hung diagonally above the highlands. The starlight shone on the gray-brown rocks, the sparse withered grass, and the bare branches of the trees. It was as if this picture had never changed since the age of chaos. For thousands of years, the old constellations in the ancient starry sky dimmed, but they would burn brightly again. The new and the old kept replacing each other until the gods left the world. But the starry sky was still as bright as before. The cold wind howled from the highlands and the grass and trees drooped. The sound of horse hooves came from afar. Soon they could see the knight on the horse. He was wearing a gray battle robe and a magic light ball was floating not far from his shoulder. These border fortress cavalry were not uncommon in this area. Since the Toquinen lion beastmen's invasion, routine patrols had become more frequent. But on the Rokizi Highlands side of the Broken Sword Mountain Range Fortress Group, such patrols were more or less overstaffed. The knight let the magic light ball fly around the road and then returned to his side. The light ball swept across the grassland and there was nothing unusual. It was unlikely that there would be anything unusual. This was the Empire's territory, and the lion beastmen were far away on the other side of the Broken Sword Mountain Range. Nothing unusual. Nothing on my side either. Well, to be honest, I still don't understand the purpose of our work. Those stinking lions are still far away from here. Why do we have to brave the cold to look at these rocks? In this godforsaken place there are only rocks and rocks. Sometimes I even wonder if even a lizard would want to stay under these damn rocks. Rock lizards will build their nests under these rocks, brother. So the enemy of the Empire is those rock lizards. The knight chuckled. Enough, you idiot, the captain of the knights scolded. Don't ask a question you already know the answer to. Our main mission is to guard against the bandits and cultists within our borders. Don't be greedy. I heard that the Rogerians couldn't even defeat the Aween's people, and were chased away by a bumpkin from the south. The knight burst into a roar of laughter, which gradually faded away into nothingness. As the light of the magic gradually faded away, a pair of shining eyes appeared under the shadow of the rock. It was a pair of prismatic pupils, like a cat's eyes in amber. The owner of the eyes stood motionless beside the weathered rock, staring at the direction where the Imperial Knight disappeared. Its scaly skin was almost the same color as the grayish-brown soil. It waited until the Imperial Knight was far away before it moved slightly, revealing a triangular head. This strange creature was wearing simple leather armor. There were some metal pieces on the leather armor, but the surface had been specially treated, as if it could blend in with its skin. It carried a longbow on its back, which was obviously its main weapon. It made a hissing sound as it turned around and walked behind the rock. After crossing a large grassland, a cliff appeared. It stood at the edge of the cliff and looked down. Below the cliff, on a steep narrow path, there was a creature that was almost the same as it, looking in this direction vigilantly. It immediately raised its hand to the other party and hissed a strange word. The latter immediately turned its head and used the same voice to pass down the cliff. Then, 3 or 4 of the same words were answered in the canyon. After a while, 1, 2, 3 and 4 similar creatures separated the fog in the canyon and appeared from the bottom of the cliff. Behind them there was a long tail. It was obviously an army which was almost entirely composed of these lizard creatures. They were well trained and silent. When they received the command, they immediately began to climb up the cliff. At first there were only a few of them, but soon, dense black spots covered the entire cliff. A few more black spots quickly rose from the bottom of the canyon. They were a kind of monster with a human face and a bird's body. They were flying through the fog, flapping their wings and flying out of the fog. These harpies whistled over the lizardmen's heads. The lizardmen standing beside the cliff turned around, and the moment it turned back, countless harpies were flying out of the fog, one after another towards the southern sky. It seemed that in an instant these monsters covered the entire night sky. The lizardmen began to climb up the cliff, and soon more strange creatures appeared behind them. Cavemen, minotaurs, nest lords, manticores, cave giants, and finally, a Medusa wearing a white linen robe with snake hair and a human face. Medusa came to the lizardman's side and said something with a strange accent. The lizard man turned around to look at her, nodded, and said something in the same language. Medusa smiled and spoke again, but this time she spoke in the ancient Toquenan language. Praise the holy earth, praise Martha. At this moment, beside the two of them, an army that was hidden in the darkness, hidden from all history and legends, and hidden from everyone's expectations was stepping onto the stage of this era. They all had a common name, Georgandy Ridge. The night was quiet in the hills, and in the valley surrounded by mountains the diplomatic group's camp was divided into 2. Most of the tents and carriages were the captives of the nobles of the empire. Brando did not have to worry about the tents and carriages because they were prepared by the nobles of the empire. These nobles who were once arrogant but now became hostages were not mistreated in any way. Other than not being able to freely enter and leave the camp, Brando allowed them to buy all kinds of luxuries, except for women of course. On the other hand, the diplomatic group's camp was much smaller in comparison. The carriages surrounded only a few tents, and the largest and most luxurious one was Nun Princess Magadal's tent, followed by Dilfri's tent, which was specially prepared by Brando for the daughter of Count Yenbao. As for the little Prince Haru's tent, it was not very eye-catching, and was even slightly inferior to Avram's, which was in line with his sister's teachings. But at this moment, the little prince's tent was brightly lit, and there were even sounds of dispute from time to time. Your Highness, Baron Lutney's voice was not loud, but it was very powerful. He was an envoy from the kingdom, an envoy sent to the diplomatic corps. It sounded very strange and unreasonable, but it also showed the royal faction's helplessness in a way. What Brando did was too shocking. Of course, Makarov and Oberway could not guess how the Emperor of the Cruz Empire would view this matter. But if they were to look at it from the worst perspective, the only way they could think of was to send an envoy to find a way to make the Count control his actions. The Baron in front of them represented Makarov, but he was not Makarov's trusted aide, but a more fanatical member of the royal faction. Before he came, he had already made up his mind that he would not be able to convince the unruly Count. But he did not forget that there was a crown prince in the diplomatic group. If the prince supported him and the other nobles' descendants stood on his side, Brando would not be able to do it alone, right? He had already planned it out, so when he arrived at the diplomatic group, he went to find the prince in the middle of the night. He picked a time when most of the others were present, and when Brando and Maynard left to investigate the battlefield. He looked at Haruz and continued, "These days, are you just going to watch the situation develop like this?" Haruz looked at her in confusion. "Mr. Envoy, I don't understand what you're saying." "I'm saying that since the Ebon Rampart, you have not expressed any opinions. What is going on right now, Your Highness? Can't you see it at all?" Haruz lowered his long eyelashes and thought for a moment. "I think I understand," he said, "but I don't think my teacher has done anything wrong." Baron Lutney looked at the future crown prince in astonishment, as if he had heard wrongly. For a moment, he almost wanted to go up and pull the prince's face to see if the young prince had been secretly swapped by his crazy teacher, or if he had been fed some kind of magic potion by that guy. "Your Highness," he could not help but say with a dry mouth, "do you know how dangerous what he wants to do is? He is gambling with the fate of the kingdom and the fate of millions of people." Baron Lutney, at this moment, Dilfrey finally couldn't help but speak. Although she still looked a little sickly and her complexion didn't look too good under the candlelight, she still frowned and replied weakly, "When you said that, did you really think about the fate of millions of people? Do you really think that it matters to you?" Baron Lutney's face did not turn red, and his heart did not skip a beat as he replied, "All right, I admit that it was just an excuse, but you can't let him do as he pleases. I think the Count knows what he is doing. He is not such a selfish person." Dilfrey thought for a moment and replied, "You." The Baron from Ampere Seal looked at these people and for a moment he could not help but feel a little confused. Are these people still nobles? Where do they stand? Helpless, he could only ask for help from an outsider. "Princess Magadal, what do you think? I am not Erewhon's people, and it is not appropriate for me to interfere in your affairs. However, at the Black Sword Rampart, it was indeed the Empire's fault. When this matter reaches the Holy Cathedral, I will also stand on the side of justice." The nun princess smiled gently. "Besides, I still owe the Count a favor, so it is reasonable for me to help him." Baron Lutney was speechless for a moment. Now only that damn fatty Avram was on his side. At first, he thought that there was also the Duke's daughter who looked more rational, but Miss Eugenie bit her lip, and with a bitter look on her face she refused to speak. He could not help but look at Enaid, who lowered her head and looked at her toes, not saying a word in this situation. As for that guy from Lantern Island, needless to say, he was firmly on Brando's side. Ever since that guy saved those refugees at the Black Sword Rampart, he had stepped on the same boat as the Count. As for that officer from Yanalasu, Baron Lutney felt that a mere officer might not be qualified to participate in this meeting, so he could not be bothered with him. But in this way he suddenly found that he could not persuade anyone, and this was quite different from his original plan. He stood there for a long time, and finally Haruz said to him thoughtfully, "Mr. Envoy, I think I understand what you mean. I will persuade the teacher a little. It is late, you should go and rest." Baron Lutney looked at the little prince, speechless. He did not want a little persuasion which sounded unreliable. If that lunatic could listen to advice, he would not have done such a heinous thing. When he walked out of the tent in a daze, he could not figure out what the problem was for a while, but he had a strange thought in his mind. It seemed that the little prince was a little different than before. In the past, this prince would not have dared to ask him to leave so tactfully. After everyone left one by one, a graceful figure quietly sneaked into the little prince's tent. The newcomer was dressed in a white robe and sat down next to Haruz with a smile. She looked at the little prince with her slanted eyes and said, "They verbally support your teacher, but they may not think so in their hearts." Haruz replied with some embarrassment, "Because no one knows what the teacher is thinking. After all, Erewhon can't bear the thunderous anger of the Empire. Sister Lasmika, what do you think?" "Realistically speaking," Medusa smiled mysteriously, "the reason he chose is very naive. The Empire can have dignity but small countries don't. In the eyes of the nobles, the reason for war should be more practical things, land, population, power, and money. But from an ideal point of view for your kingdom, it does need a flag that can gather people's hearts and beliefs." But Lasmika looked at the little prince playfully, as if she found it very interesting. Legitimacy and orthodoxy, these sacred words, what do they mean to a count? Why are those who support you and your sister so frightened and exasperated? You and your sister are really a pair of naive little cuties, and that count is also ridiculously naive. I'm really curious that the fate of a kingdom is in your hands. Yes, this may be fate's arrangement. It's always so wonderful. Haruz looked at Medusa in a daze. "Sister Lasmika, but you know I've never been interested in this. Teacher is very good to me. He is an upright person and I like him very much. This is where you are naive, little cutie. Medusa approached the little prince, held his face with her hands, and breathed on his face like orchids. What belongs to you will always be yours. This is the meaning of orthodoxy. As long as you are still in this world, he can never be His Majesty the King of Erewhon. People gather around him because of justice, and they will leave him because of injustice. One day I really want to see what he will choose in the end. But, the little prince shook his head seriously, I don't think teacher is that kind of person. She giggled. Maybe he'll surprise us all. Lasmika let go of Haruz and said to him with a smile, You just asked me what I think. What about you, Your Majesty the future king, what do you think? Haruz frowned slightly. He said, I think my master is right in what he says. Ideals are of value to men. But my sister, Monsieur Makarov, Lord Oberwell, they have taught me the importance of ideals and convictions. Why, when it comes to matters as they are, do men always favor practical interests? Ideals can't be eaten, Your Highness. After Lasmika said this, she suddenly thought of something. Her eyes flashed slightly and she patted Haruz's shoulder gently. But maybe this is just a way for the weak to comfort themselves. Little prince, if you really want to know what your teacher thinks, you might as well let me see him. Sister Lasmika, if you want to see teacher, can't you do it at any time? No one in the camp will stop you? Haruz asked, puzzled. Lasmika smiled mysteriously and looked at the little prince silently, as if the latter had said something stupid. Haruz was slightly startled as if he understood something and replied, I see. Then please go and see teacher, Sister Lasmika. Little cutie, Lasmika gently kissed the little prince on the forehead, let me tell you a secret. What? The magic that your teacher taught you is an ancient magic that has been lost for a long time. Even I have only seen a few records of it on some remnant stone tablets. I still don't understand the meaning behind his actions. I know, Haruz replied, teacher told me that my talent is better suited to learn this kind of magic. Medusa looked at him with her prismatic pupils. Then he must not have told you the other thing. Haruz looked at her, puzzled. Ancient magic, through the hands of Tumen, was only taught to 4 people. Their names were the Sage of Earth and Tolerance, Alanta. The Sage of Light and Justice, Fanzan. The Sage of Flame and Courage, Flame King Gretel. The Sage of Flowing Wind and Wisdom, Saint Tassol the Wind Empress. They were the kings of kings, the ancient sages, the pioneers of the history of black iron. Since them, no one has systematically mastered ancient magic. The little prince opened his mouth slightly and sat there in a daze. Brando and Maynard rode side by side on the rolling hills. The starry night was gradually fading, and the sky in the east was pale blue. They could vaguely see the flashes of light on the horizon of Antras. It was the Evergreen Walkway, the most prosperous area between the floating cloud hills and the flower-leaf territory. Count Gideon chose a good battlefield. Brando looked into the distance at the continuous forest on the rolling hills and suddenly spoke. Maynard looked back at him. The players of the Empire once wrote the most inspiring stories here and changed a part of history. Today we are going to do the same here. The stories that happened in this land are always so similar. Brando's vision suddenly reflected a sea of spears. The army of the Anzaruta nobles was entering the battlefield they had already booked. He took a breath, patted his mount and said to Maynard beside him, Let's go back, we have seen enough. The knight nodded silently. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.